The Golden Fortress by Satyajit Ray. Chapter 1. Feluda stopped reading and shut his book with a bang. Then he snapped his fingers twice, yawned heavily, and said, "Geometry." I asked, "Were you reading a book on geometry all this while?" The book was covered with newspaper, so I could not see its title. All I knew was that Feluda had borrowed it from Uncle Sidhu, who was passionate about books. He bought quite a few and took great care of them. In fact, he did not like lending his books to anyone, but Feluda was an exception. Feluda knew it, so he always put a protective cover on any book that he brought from Uncle Sidhu's house. Feluda lit a charminator and blew out 2 smoke rings, one after the other. "There is no such thing as a book on geometry," he told me. "Any book may be seen as one, because everything around us is related to geometry. Did you see those smoke rings? When they left my mouth, they were perfect circles. Now just think. There are circles everywhere. Look at your own body. The iris in your eye is a circle. With the help of the iris, you can look at the sun and the moon. If you think of them as flat objects, they are circles. But of course they are actually spheres, each a solid bubble. That's geometry. The planets in the solar system are orbiting the sun in elliptic curves. There's geometry again. When you spat out of the window a little while ago, you shouldn't have done that. It's almost unhygienic, and if you do it again, you'll get a sharp rap on the head. But anyway, that spit went out in a parabolic curve. Geometry, see? Have you ever looked at a spider's web in any detail? It starts with a simple square. Then 2 diagonal lines run through it, and the square is divided into 4 triangles. After that, the spider starts weaving a spiral web from the intersecting point of those diagonal lines. That keeps growing in size until it covers the entire square. If you think about it, your head will start reeling. It's something so amazing. It was a Sunday morning. The 2 of us were sitting in our living room on the ground floor. Baba had gone to visit his childhood friend, Subimal, as he did every Sunday. Feluda was seated on a sofa, his feet resting on a low table. I was on a divan, leaning on a cushion placed against the wall. In my hand was a game. It was a maze made of plastic. Inside the maze were tiny metal balls. Over the last half hour, I had been trying to make those metal balls slip through the various lanes and mazes and go straight to its center. Now I realized that the game was a matter of complex geometry too. A Durga Puja was being held in Nihar and Pintu's house, which was near ours. Someone was playing a song over a loudspeaker. "Ye Jo Mohabbat Hai" from the film Kati Patang. Fine spiral grooves on a circular record. More geometry. Geometry applies not just to objects you can see, Feluda continued. The human mind often follows geometric patterns. A simple man's mind will run along a straight line. Others, who are not so simple, may have minds that twist and wriggle like a snake. And the mind of a lunatic? No one can tell how that's going to run. It's a matter of the most convoluted geometry. Thanks to Feluda, I had come across plenty of people from every category. What kind of geometric pattern did he fall into? When I asked him, Feluda said, "You might call me a many-pointed star." And I? Am I a satellite of that star? You are merely a point, something that indicates a position, but has no significance of its own. I like to think of myself as a satellite. The only problem is that I cannot play that role all the time. I managed to be with Feluda when we had trouble in Gangtok, because that was during school holidays. 2 cases had followed. One was a murder in Dhalbhumgar, and the other was to do with a forged will in Patna, which I missed altogether. Now my school was closed once again for puja. I was wondering if a new case would come along. Who knew whether it really would? But then, Feluda did tell me that if one badly wants something to happen, and if one's will is strong enough, then a particular wish may well come true, more or less automatically. I quite like to think what happened that Sunday morning was simply a result of my willing it. A song from the film Johnny Mera Naam had just started on the loudspeaker. Feluda had flicked a quantity of ash into an ashtray and picked up the Hindustan Standard. I was toying with the idea of going out when someone rattled the knocker on our door very loudly. Baba, I knew, would not be back before 12 o'clock. This had to be someone else. I opened the door and found a simple, mild-looking man, wearing a dhoti and a blue shirt. "Does a Pradosh Mitter live in this house?" he asked, raising his voice to make himself heard. The loudspeaker was making quite a racket. Feluda rose from the sofa and came to the door on hearing his name. "Where have you come from?" he asked. "All the way from Shambazar," the man replied. "Please come in." The man stepped into the living room. "Please sit down. I am Pradosh Mitter." Oh, I see. I didn't know. I didn't realize you were so young." The man sat down on a chair next to the sofa, looking visibly impressed. But the smile on his face disappeared almost at once. "What can I do for you?" Feluda asked. The man cleared his throat. "I have heard a lot about you from Kailash Chaudhary. He seems to think very highly of you. He's one of my customers, you see. My name is Sudhir Dhar. I have a bookshop in College Street, Dhar and Company. You may have seen it." Feluda nodded briefly before saying to me, "Topshe, please shut that window." I shut the window that overlooked the street. That reduced the noise, and Mr. Dhar could then speak normally. "About a week ago, there was a press report about my son. Did you—" "Press report? What did it say?" "About his being a Jatismar. About a boy called Mukul?" "Yes." "So the report is true?" "You see, from the way he speaks, the kind of things he says, it does seem as if—" Mr. Dhar broke off. I knew what the word Jatismar meant. A person who can recall events from a previous life is called a Jatismar. Apparently, there are people who get periodic flashes of memory related to a life that they had lived long before they were born in their present incarnation. Mind you, even Feluda does not know whether or not there is any truth behind this whole business. Feluda picked up the packet of Charminar and offered it to Mr. Dhar, who smiled and shook his head. Then he said, "Perhaps you remember what my son told the reporter? He's only 8, but he described a place which he is supposed to have seen. Yet I'm sure nobody from Ray family, not even my forefathers, has been there, let alone my son. We are very ordinary people, you see. I only have that shop, and the book trade these days is—" "Doesn't your son talk of a fortress?" Feluda interrupted him. "Yes, that's right, a golden fortress. There was a cannon on its roof, a lot of fighting, and several people were killed. My son says he has seen it all. He used to wear a turban and ride a camel on the sand. He mentioned sand quite frequently. And animals. Camels, elephants, and horses. Oh, and peacocks. There is a mark near his elbow. We always thought it was a birthmark, but he says he was once attacked by a peacock, and the mark shows where the bird pecked him." "Has he ever mentioned exactly where he used to live?" "No, but he does say that he could see this golden fortress from his house. Sometimes he draws funny squiggles with a pencil and says, 'Look, that's my house.' If you look at it, well, yes, it does appear to be a house." "Could he not have seen all that in a book? I mean, you have a bookshop, don't you? So maybe he saw pictures of this place in a book?" "Yes, that's a possibility. But other children also look at pictures in books. They don't talk incessantly about what they have seen, do they? If you had seen my son, you would know what I mean. To tell you the truth, his mind seems to be elsewhere. His own family, his parents, brothers and sisters, other relatives, no one seems to matter to him. In fact, he doesn't even look at us when he talks." "When did this whole thing start?" "About 2 months ago. It started with those pictures, you see. One day, when I got back home from the shop, it had rained a lot that day. My son began showing me the pictures he had drawn. At first, I paid him no attention. Every child likes talking about imaginary lands, and he was chattering away. So I ignored him. It was my wife who first noticed that there was something odd. Then we listened more carefully to his words and watched his behavior over the next few weeks. Then, one of my other customers, Dr. Hemanga Hajra, have you heard of him? Yes, he's a parapsychologist, isn't he? I've certainly heard of him. But didn't that press report say he was going to travel somewhere with your son? Not going to, has gone. They have already left. Dr. Hajra came to my house 3 times. He thought Mukul was talking of Rajasthan. So I said, yes, that could be true. Then, in the end, Dr. Hajra told me he was doing research on this whole business of recalling a previous life. He wanted to take Mukul to Rajputana. He thought that if Mukul could actually go back to the same place, he might remember several other things, and that would help his research. So he said he'd pay for everything and take great care of my son. I wouldn't have to worry. And then? Feluda leant forward. His voice had changed. Clearly, he was finding all this quite interesting. Then they left. That's all. Didn't Mukul mind leaving home? Mr. Dhar smiled a little wanly. Mind? Oh no. He was ready to go with Dr. Hajra the minute he offered to show him the golden fortress. My son, you see, is not like other children. He's very different. We find him awake at 3 in the morning sometimes. He'd be humming a song. Not any film song, mind you. Something like a folk song, like the kind of music you hear in villages. But certainly it doesn't come from any village in Bengal. That much I can tell you. I know a little about music. I play the harmonium, you see. Mr. Dhar had told us a lot about his son. But he had said nothing about why he had come to see Feluda, or why he needed to consult a detective. Feluda's next question made the whole conversation take a different turn. "Didn't your son say something about hidden treasure?" Mr. Dar began to look even more depressed. "That is the biggest problem," he sighed. "He told me about it some time ago, but when he mentioned it to the reporter, well, that proved disastrous." "Why do you say that?" Feluda asked. Then he called out to our cook Srinath and told him to bring tea. "Let me explain," Mr. Dhar continued. "Dr. Hajra left for Rajasthan with Mukul yesterday morning by the Tufan Express. And—" "Do you know where in Rajasthan he will go?" Feluda interrupted. "Jodhpur, so he said. Since Mukul had mentioned sand, he said he would start with the northwest. Anyway, what happened was that, yesterday evening, someone kidnapped a boy from our area. He was about Mukul's age." "And you think that boy was kidnapped by mistake? Because they thought he was Mukul?" "Yes, there is no question about that. My son and this other boy happen to look similar. The other boy is Shivratan Mukherjee's grandson. Mr. Mukherjee is one of our neighbors. He is a solicitor. The boy is called Neelu. They were naturally most upset, had to call the police, and there was enormous fuss, as you can imagine. But now that they have got him back, things have calmed down." "Got him back? Already?" "Early this morning." "But how does that make any difference? Tell me. I am going mad with anxiety, I tell you. Those kidnappers obviously realize they got the wrong boy, and Neelu has told them that Mukul has gone to Jodhpur. Suppose they chase Mukul all the way to Jodhpur just to lay their hands on that treasure?" Feluda did not reply. He was lost in thought. 4 deep lines had appeared on his forehead. My heart was beating faster. Could it mean that we would go to Rajasthan during these puja holidays? Jodhpur, Chittor, Udaipur. I had only heard these names and read about these places in history books. And, of course, in Rajkahani by Avanindranath Tagore. Uncle Naresh had given me a copy on my birthday. Srinath came in with the tea. He placed the tray on the table. Feluda offered a cup to Mr. Dhar. "From what I heard about you from Kailash Chaudhary," Mr. Dhar began hesitantly, "it appears that you were Anyway, I was just wondering if you might be able to go to Rajasthan. If you found that Dr. Hajra and Mukul were safe, that's well and good. But suppose they were in danger? Suppose you saw something odd? I've heard that you're brave. You would tackle criminals. I am only an ordinary man, Mr. Mitter. Perhaps it is impertinent of me to have come to you. But if you did decide to go, I would certainly pay for your travel." Feluda continued to frown. After a minute's silence, he said, "I shall let you know tomorrow what I decide. I assume you have a photo of your son in your house? The one printed in the newspaper was not very clear." Mr. Dhar took a long sip of his tea. "My cousin is fond of photography. He took some photos of Mukul. My wife will have them." "Very well." Mr. Dhar finished his tea, put the cup down on a table and rose. "I have a telephone in my shop, 345-116. I'm usually in the shop from 10 o'clock. "Where do you live?" "Mecho Bazar." 7 Mechobazar Street. My house is on the main road. I went with Mr. Dhar to see him out. When he had gone, I shut the front door and returned to the living room. There is one word that I didn't quite understand, I said to Feluda. You mean parapsychologist? Yes. Those who study certain hazy aspects of the human mind are called parapsychologists. Take telepathy, for instance. You can actually get into the mind of another person and read their thoughts. Or, if your own mind is strong enough, you can influence other people's thoughts, even change them totally. Strange things happen sometimes. Suppose you were sitting here, thinking of an old friend. Suddenly, out of the blue, the same friend rang you. A parapsychologist would tell you that there was nothing sudden or unexpected about it. If your friend rang you, it was because of strong telepathy. But there is more, like extrasensory perception, or ESP for short. It can warn you about future events, or, for that matter, take this business of recalling a previous life. All these could be subjects a parapsychologist might wish to study. Is this Hemanga Hajra a famous parapsychologist? Yes, one of the best known. He has been abroad, given lectures, and I think even formed a society. Do you believe in such things? What I believe is simply that it is foolish to accept or reject anything without sufficient evidence. If you don't keep an open mind, you're a fool. One look at history would show you plenty of examples of such stupidity. There was a time when some people thought that the earth was flat. Did you know that? They also thought that the earth came to an end at one particular point, and you couldn't travel beyond that. But when the navigator Magellan began his journey round the world from one place and returned to the same spot, all those who thought the earth was flat began scratching their heads. Then there have been people who thought the earth was fixed, and other planets, even the sun, moved around it. Some thought the sky was like a huge ball turned upside down. All the stars were fixed on it like jewels, they thought. It was Copernicus who proved that the sun remained stationary, and the Earth and other planets in the solar system orbited the sun. But Copernicus thought this movement followed a circular motion. Then Kepler came along and proved that everything moved in elliptic curves. After that, Galileo... But anyway, there's no point in talking about all that. Your mind is too young and too immature to grasp such things. Clever detective though he was, Feluda did not seem to realize one simple thing. None of his jibes and jeers was going to spoil my excitement, because my heart was already telling me that the holidays were going to be spent in Rajasthan. We would see a new place and unravel a new mystery. What remained to be tested was the strength of my own telepathy. Chapter 2. Feluda had told Mr. Dhar that he would take a day to make up his mind. But within an hour of Mr. Dhar's departure, he decided that he would go to Rajasthan. When he told me about it, I asked, "I'm going with you, aren't I? If you can name 5 places in Rajasthan that have forts, all within a minute, then you might stand a chance." Jodhpur, Jaipur, Chittor, Bikaner, and Bundi. Feluda glanced at his watch and sprang to his feet. It took him exactly 3.5 minutes to change from a kurta pajama into a shirt and trousers. It's Sunday, so Fairley Palace will stay open till 12 o'clock. Let me go quickly and make our reservations, he said. It was 1 o'clock by the time Feluda returned. The first thing he did upon his return was to look up Hemanga Hajra's phone number in the directory and ring him. When I asked him why he was calling someone who was out of town, Feluda said, I needed proof that what Mr. Dhar told us was true. And did you get it? Yes. After lunch, Feluda spent the whole afternoon stretched on his bed, a pillow tucked under his chest, going through 5 different books. 2 of them were Pelican books on parapsychology. Feluda said he had borrowed them from a friend. Of the others, one was Todd's book on Rajasthan, the second was called A Guide to India, Pakistan, Burma and Ceylon, and the third was a book on Indian history, but I can't remember who wrote it. In the evening, when we had had our tea, Feluda said, Get ready. We are going out. We need to visit Mr. Dhar. By this time, I had told Baba about our plans. He was very pleased to hear that we were going to Rajasthan. He had been there twice in his childhood with my grandfather. Don't miss Chittor, he told me. The fort in Chittor is quite awe-inspiring. It's easy enough to guess what made the Rajputs such brave warriors. We arrived at Mr. Dhar's house at around 6:30. When he heard that Feluda was prepared to go to Rajasthan, Mr. Dhar looked both relieved and grateful. I do not know how to thank you, he exclaimed. It isn't yet time to start thanking me, Mr. Dhar. You must assume that we are going purely as tourists, not because you asked us to. Anyway, we have very little time. There are 2 things we need. One is a photo of your son. The other is a chat with Nilu, the boy who was kidnapped. Let me see what I can do. Usually, Nilu is never at home in the evenings, especially now that puja is round the corner. But I don't think that today he will be allowed to go out of his own. Wait, I'll get that photo. Shivrathan Mukherjee, the solicitor, lived only 3 houses away, on the same side of the road. We found him at home, having a cup of tea in his living room with another gentleman. Mr. Mukherjee's visitor seemed to have a skin disease. There were white patches on his face. When Mr. Dhar explained why we were there, Mr. Mukherjee remarked, My grandson seems to have become quite famous, thanks to your son. Please sit down. Manohar? Manohar turned out to be his servant. Bring more tea, Mr. Mukherjee told him, and see if you can find Nilu. Tell him I have sent for him. We found ourselves 3 chairs placed by the side of a large table. The walls on both sides were covered by very tall bookcases, almost reaching the ceiling. They were crammed with fat tomes. Feluda had once told me that no one needed to consult books as much as a lawyer. While we were waiting for Nilu, I had a look at Mukul's photo. It had been taken on their roof. The little boy was standing in the sun, frowning straight at the camera. There was no smile on his face. Mr. Mukherjee said, We asked Nilu a lot of questions too. At first, he was in such a state of shock that he wasn't talking at all. Now he appears more normal. Have the police been told? Feluda asked. Yes, we told the police when he went missing, but he came back before the police could do anything. The servant returned with Nilu. Mr. Dhar was right. Nilu did bear a strong resemblance to the boy in the photo. He looked at us suspiciously. Clearly, he had not yet got over his ordeal. Suddenly, Feluda asked him, "Did you hurt your hand, Nilu?" Mr. Mukherjee opened his mouth to say something, but Feluda made a gesture and stopped him. Nilu answered the question himself. "When they pulled my hand, it burned a lot." There was a cut over his wrist, clearly visible. "They? You mean there was more than one person?" "One man covered my eyes and my mouth. Then he picked me up and put me in a car. Another man drove the car. I felt very scared." "So would I," Feluda told him. "In fact, I would have felt much more scared than you. You are very brave. When they caught you, what were you doing?" "I was going to Moti's house. They have a Durga Puja in their house. I wanted to see the idol. Moti is in my class." "Was it very quiet in the streets? Not many people about?" "The day before yesterday," Mr. Mukherjee informed us, "we had some trouble here. A bomb went off. So since last evening, there have been fewer people out in the streets." Feluda nodded and said, Then he turned to Nilu once more. "Where did they take you?" "I don't know. They tied a cloth over my eyes. The car drove on and on." "And then?" "Then they made me sit in a chair. One of them said, 'Which school do you go to?' I told him. Then he said, 'We are going to ask you a few questions. Tell us exactly what you know. If you do, we will drop you in front of your school. Can you go home from there?' So I said, 'Yes.' Then I said, 'You must hurry. My mother will scold me if I get late.' Then he said, 'Where is the Golden Fortress?' I said, 'I don't know, and nor does Mukul. He only knows there is a fort, that's all.' Then the two men began talking with each other in English. I heard them say, 'Mistake.' One man said to me, 'What's your name?' I said, 'Mukul is my friend, but he has gone to Rajasthan.' He said, 'Do you know where in Rajasthan he has gone?' I told him, 'Jaipur.' 'You said Jaipur?' Feluda asked him. 'No, Jodhpur. Yes, that's what I said, Jodhpur.' Nilu stopped. All of us remained silent. The servant had placed tea and sweets before us, but no one seemed interested in them. 'Can you think of anything else?' Feluda prompted Nilu. Nilu thought for a minute. Then he said, 'One of them was smoking a cigarette.' No, it was a cigar." "Do you know how a cigar smells?" "Yes, my uncle smokes them." "All right. Where did you sleep at night?" "I don't know." "You don't know? What do you mean?" "Well, they said, 'Here is some milk. Drink it.' Then someone handed me a very heavy glass. I drank the milk, then fell asleep. I was still sitting in the chair." "And then? When you woke up?" Nilu looked uncertainly at his grandfather. Mr. Mukherjee smiled. "He woke up only after he was brought home," he explained. "They left him outside his school, possibly very early this morning. He was still asleep. The man who delivers our newspaper every day happened to be passing by a little later and saw him. It was he who came and told us. Then I went with my son and brought him back. Our doctor has seen him. He said Nilu was given a sleeping draught. probably a heavier dose than what might normally be given to a child. Feluda looked grave. He picked up his cup of tea and muttered under his breath, "Scoundrels." Then he patted Nilu's back and said, "Thank you, Nilu Babu. You may go now." When we had said goodbye to Mr. Mukherjee and were out in the street once more, Mr. Dhar asked, "Do you think there is reason for concern?" "What I can see is that some greedy and reckless people have become unduly curious about your son. What's difficult to say is whether they will really go all the way to Rajasthan. By the way, I think you should write to Dr. Hajra, just to introduce me. After all, he doesn't know me. So if I can show him your letter, it will help." Mr. Dhar wrote the letter, handed it to Feluda, and offered to pay for our travel once more. Feluda paid no attention. As we approached our bus stop, Mr. Dhar said, "Please let me know, sir, when you get there and find them. I'll be ever so worried. Dr. Hajra has promised to write as well. But even if he doesn't, you must. At least one letter." On reaching home, Feluda took out his famous blue notebook, volume 6, before either of us began packing. Then he sat down on his bed and said, "Let's get some dates sorted out. When did Dr. Hajra leave with Mukul to go to Rajasthan?" "Yesterday, 9th October. When was Nilu kidnapped?" "Yesterday, in the evening. And he returned this morning. That's 10th October. We are leaving tomorrow morning, the 11th. We'll reach Agra on the 12th. Then we'll have to change trains there and catch one in the evening that goes to Bandikui. Leave Bandikui at midnight and reach Marwar the same day. That'll be the 13th evening." 13th. Feluda continued to mutter and did some funny calculations. Then he said, "Geometry. Even here you will find geometry. A single point, and there are various lines converging to meet that point. Geometry." Chapter 3. Half an hour ago, we boarded a train at the Agra Fort station to go to Bandikui. We had about 3 hours to kill in Agra, so we went to see the Taj Mahal again, after 10 years, and Feluda gave me a short lecture on the geometry of the building. Yesterday, before leaving Calcutta, we had to attend to some important business. Perhaps I should mention it here. Since the Tufan Express left at 9:30 in the morning, we were both up quite early. At around 6 o'clock, after we had had tea, Feluda said, "We ought to visit Uncle Sidhu before we go. If he can give us some information, it will really help." Uncle Sidhu lives in Sardar Shankar Road, which is only 5 minutes from our Tara Road. Uncle Sidhu is a strange character. He spent most of his life doing various kind of businesses, earning a lot of money, and then losing much of it. Now he has retired. His main passion is books. He buys them in large numbers and spends most of his time on reading, and the rest on playing chess all by himself. Sometimes he consults a book on chess in between making moves. His other passion is food, or rather, experimenting with food. He likes mixing one item with another. According to him, yogurt mixed with an omelette tastes like ambrosia. To tell the truth, he is not related to us. He used to live next door to us back in our ancestral village, which I have never seen. So he's like an elder brother to my father, and we call him Uncle. When we reached his house, he was seated on a low stool, blocking the entrance through his front door, and having his hair cut by his barber, although he has no hair except for some round the back of his head. Upon seeing us, he moved his stool a little and allowed us to go through. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said. "Yell for Narayan. He'll give you some tea." Uncle Sidhu's room was very simply furnished. There was only a divan, 2 chairs, and 3 very large bookcases. Books covered half the divan. We knew that the little empty space on it was where Uncle Sidhu liked to sit, so we took the 2 chairs. Feluda had remembered to bring the book he had borrowed, which was still covered with newspaper. He slipped it back into an empty slot on a shelf. The barber continued to work on Uncle Sidhu's hair. "Felu," said Uncle Sidhu, "you are a detective. I hope you have read up on the history of criminal investigation. It doesn't matter what you specialize in. If you know something about the history of your profession, you will gain more confidence and find your work much more interesting." "Yes, of course," Feluda replied politely. "Who was the first to discover the technique of identifying a criminal through his fingerprints? Can you tell me?" Feluda winked at me and said, "I can't remember. I did read about it somewhere, but now—" I could tell that Feluda knew the answer all right, but was pretending that he didn't, just to please Uncle Sidhu. Most people would immediately tell you that it was Alphonse Bertillon, but that's wrong. The correct name is Juan Vuatich. Remember that. He was from Argentina. He was the first to emphasize the importance of thumbprints. Then he divided those prints into 4 categories. A few years later, Henry from England strengthened the system. Feluda glanced at his watch and decided to come straight to the point. "You may have heard of Dr. Hemanga Hajra, the parapsychologist?" "Certainly," said Uncle Sidhu. "Why, I saw his name in the papers only the other day. What's he done? Something fishy? But he's not the kind of man to get mixed up in funny business. On the contrary, he has exposed others' cheats and frauds." "Really?" Feluda looked up. We were about to hear an interesting story. "Yes, don't you know about it? It happened about 4 years ago and was reported in the press. A Bengali gentleman— No, I should not call him a gentleman. He was actually a scoundrel— started a center for spiritual healing in Chicago. Bang in the city center. Clients poured in every day. The Americans have plenty of money and are easily impressed by new ideas. This Bengali claimed that he could use hypnotism and cure even the most complex diseases. The same sort of thing that Anton Mesmer did in Europe in the 18th century. Perhaps the Bengali managed to cure a couple of patients. That's not unusual. A few stray cases would be successful. But around the same time, Hajra arrived in Chicago on a lecture tour. He went to see things for himself and caught the man out. Oh God, it was a scandal. In the end, the American government forced him to leave the country. Yes, I can remember his name now. He called himself Bhavananda. That man, Hajra, though, is a solid character. At least, that's the impression one gets from his articles. I have got 2 of them. See in the right-hand corner of that bookcase on your left. You'll find 3 journals of the Parapsychological Society. Feluda borrowed all 3 journals. Now, sitting on the train, he was leafing through them. I was looking out of the window and watching the scenery. A little while ago, we had left Uttar Pradesh and entered Rajasthan. The sun here has a different brilliance. No wonder the men are so powerful. These words in Bengali came from the bench opposite us. It was a 4-berth compartment, and there were 4 passengers. The man who had spoken those words looked perfectly meek and mild, was very thin, and probably shorter than me by at least 2 inches. And I was only 15, so it was likely that I would grow taller with time. This man was at least 35. There was no chance that his height would ever change. As he was dressed in a blue bush shirt and trousers, I had been unable to guess from his clothes that he was another Bengali. He glanced at Feluda, smiled and said, "I have been listening to your conversation for a long time. I'm lucky to have found fellow Bengalis so far away from home. In fact, I had assumed that for a whole month I'd be forced to boycott my mother tongue." Feluda asked, possibly purely out of politeness, "Are you going far?" "Up to Jodhpur. Then I will decide where else I might go." "What about yourselves?" "We are going to Jodhpur too." "Oh, wonderful! Are you also a writer?" "Oh no," Feluda smiled. "I am only a reader. Do you write?" "Are you familiar with the name of Jatayu?" "Jatayu?" I asked. "The writer of all those thrillers?" I had read 1 or 2 of his books, Shivers in the Sahara and The Ferocious Foe. I had borrowed them from our school library. "You are Jatayu?" Feluda asked. "Yes, sir." The man flashed his teeth, his head bent in a bow. "I am Jatayu, at your service. I write under that pseudonym. Namaskar." "Namaskar. My name is Pradosh Mitter, and this is Shriman Tapesh Ranjan." How could Feluda keep a straight face? I could feel laughter bubbling up inside me, threatening to burst forth. This was Jatayu. And I used to think a writer who could write such tales would have looks to match. Perhaps even James Bond would be put in the shade. My real name is Lal Mohan Ganguly, but please don't tell anyone. A pseudonym, like a disguise, must never be revealed. I mean, if it is, then it loses its impact, don't you think? We had bought a packet of sweet gulabi reverie in Agra. Feluda offered the packet to Jatayu and said, "You seem to have been on the move for some time." "Yes, that's—" Jatayu picked up a reverie and suddenly broke off, looking a bit confused. Then he threw a startled glance at Feluda and asked, "How can you tell?" Feluda smiled. "The strap on your wristwatch slips at times. When it does, it exposes the only part of your arm that isn't sunburnt." Jatayu's eyes grew round. "Oh my God! What terrific powers of observation you have got! Yes, you're right. I left home about 10 days ago and travelled to Delhi, Agra and Fatehpur Sikri. So far, I have only written about adventures in foreign lands. I live in Bhadreshwar, so I thought I should travel a bit, see new places. It would help me in my writing. Besides, these areas are much better suited to adventure stories. aren't they? Look at those barren hills, rising high like biceps and triceps. Our Bengal has no muscles, except, of course, for the Himalayas. You can't have a successful adventure on the plains. The three of us continued to eat the reverie. Then I caught Jatayu casting sidelong glances at Feluda. Finally, he asked, "What is your height? Please don't mind my asking." "Nearly 6 feet," Feluda replied. "Oh, that's a very good height, the same as my hero's, Prakhar Rudra. You do know his name, don't you? Prakhar is a Russian name, but it suits a Bengali too, don't you think? The thing is, you see, I've got my hero to be everything I could never be myself. God knows I tried hard enough. When I was in college, I saw advertisements of Charles Atlas in British magazines. There he was, standing proudly, his chest and all his muscles expanded, his hands on his waist. He looked like a lion. There was not even an ounce of fat on his body. His muscles rippled like waves, from head to toe. And the advertisement said, "If you follow my system, you will look like me within a month." Well, that may be true of Europeans. In Bengal, that kind of thing is impossible. My father was well off, so I wasted some of his money, sent for their lessons, and followed them religiously. Nothing happened. I remained just the same. Then an uncle said, "Try swinging from a curtain rod. You will grow taller in a month." A month? For several months I swung from a rod until one day it came off and I fell down. That dislocated my knee, but my height remained stuck at 5 feet and 3½ inches. That told me plainly that even if I were pulled in different directions by two teams, as they do in a tug of war, I would never grow any taller. So eventually, I thought enough was enough. There was no point in thinking about the muscles in my body. I decided to pay more attention to the muscles in my brain and increase my mental height. I began writing thrillers. But I knew Lal Mohan Ganguly was not a name that would help sell books. So I took a pseudonym, Jatayu, a fighter. Just think of the fight he put up with Ravan. Although our train was called the Fast Passenger, it was stopping at so many stations that it was not able to run for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. Feluda left the journals on parapsychology and began reading a book on Rajasthan. It had pictures of all the forts. Feluda was looking at those very carefully and reading the descriptions. On the upper berth opposite us was a man whose moustache and clothes proclaimed clearly that he was not a Bengali. He was eating oranges, one after another, and collecting the peel and other debris on a sheet of Urdu newspaper spread in front of him. Feluda was marking a few places in his book with a blue pencil when Lal Mohan Babu said, "May I ask you something? Are you a detective?" "Why do you ask?" "No, I mean, you could tell so easily about my travelling." "Well, I am interested in that kind of thing." "Good. You are also going to Jodhpur, didn't you say?" "Yes." "In connection with a mystery?" "If so, I'm going to join you. I mean, if you don't mind, that is. I'll never get such a chance again." "I hope you wouldn't object to riding a camel?" "A camel? Oh my God!" Lal Mohan Babu's eyes began to glint. Ship of the desert! It's always been my dream. I have written about Bedouins in one of my novels, Bloodbath in Arabia, and I have mentioned camels in Shivers in the Sahara. It's a fascinating creature. Just picture the scene. An entire row of camels, travelling through an ocean of sand, mile after mile, carrying their own water supply in their intestines. How romantic! Oh! When you wrote your novel, did you mention that bit about the intestines? Lal Mohan Babu began looking uncertain. Why? Is that incorrect? Feluda nodded. Yes. You see, the source of the water is actually in a camel's hump. The hump is really an accumulation of fat. A camel can oxidize that fat and turn it into water. So it can survive without drinking any water from 10 to 15 days. But once they do find water, camels have been known to drink as much as 25 gallons at one go. Thank goodness you told me all this, said Lal Mohan Babu. I must correct that mistake in the next edition. Chapter 4. The train was slow, but at least it wasn't running significantly late. When one has to take connecting trains, it can cause great problems if the first train is delayed. We saw the first peacocks on reaching Bharatpur. Opposite our platform, there were 3 of them roaming freely on the tracks. Feluda said to me, You will find that peacocks and parrots are as common here as crows and sparrows in Calcutta. All the men we saw had turbans on their heads and sideburns on their cheeks, the size of which seemed to be getting larger as we travelled. They were all Rajasthanis, wearing short dhotis which reached their knees, and shirts with buttons on one side. On their feet were heavy nagras. Most men were carrying stout sticks in their hands. We went to the refreshment room in the station in Bandikwi to have dinner. Tucking into his roti and meat curry, Lal Mohan Babu remarked, See all these men? There's a high probability that some of them are bandits. The Aravalli Hills act as a den for bandits. You know that, don't you? And I'm sure I don't have to tell you how powerful they are. When they are thrown into prison, they can push apart the iron bars on their windows with their bare hands and escape through the gap. Yes, I know, Feluda replied. And do you know how they punish those who cross them? They are killed, surely? No, that's the beauty of it. If a bandit is annoyed with someone, he will hunt him down, no matter where that person is hiding, and then chop his nose off with a sword. That's all. Lal Mohan Babu had just picked up a piece of meat. He forgot to put it in his mouth. Chop off his nose? He asked. Yes, so I've heard. It sounds most barbaric, like something straight out of the Dark Ages. How terrible! We caught a train to Marwar in the middle of the night. It did involve scrambling in the dark, but we found enough room for ourselves and slept well. In the morning, when I woke up, I glanced out of the window and saw an old fort in the distance, on top of a hill. Only a minute later, the train pulled into a station called Kisangarh. If you see the word Garh attached to the name of a place, you may assume that somewhere in that area there is a fort on a hilltop, Feluda said. We got down on the platform and had tea. The earthen pots in which the tea was served were much larger and stronger than the pots used in Bengal. Even the tea tasted different. Feluda thought camel's milk had been used. Perhaps that was why Lal Mohan Babu ordered a second pot when he finished the first. When I had finished mine, I found a tap on the platform and quickly brushed my teeth. Then I splashed cold water on my face and returned to our compartment. There was a Rajasthani man sitting at one end of Lal Mohan Babu's bench. On his head was a huge turban. One leg was folded up on the bench, and he was resting his chin on his raised knee. He had wrapped a shawl around himself, hiding most of his face. But I could see the color of his shirt through the shawl. It was bright red. Lal Mohan Babu saw the man and promptly abandoned his bench and moved to ours. He tried to huddle in one corner. Feluda said, "Why don't you two sit more comfortably?" He moved across to the other bench and sat down beside the Rajasthani. I began to peer more closely at the man's turban. Heaven knew how many twists and turns the fabric had made before it was finally wound so tightly round his head. Lal Mohan Babu addressed Feluda and said softly, "Powerfully suspicious. He is dressed as an ordinary villager, but how come he is in a first-class compartment? Look at that bundle. God knows if it's packed with diamonds and other precious stones." The bundle was placed next to the man. Lal Mohan Babu's comment made Feluda smile, but he said nothing. The train started. Feluda took out the book on Rajasthan from his shoulder bag. I took out Newman's Bradshaw timetable and began looking up the stations we would stop at. Each place had a strange name: Galota, Tilonia, Makarera, Visana, Sendra. Where had these names come from? Feluda had told me once that a lot of local history was always hidden in the name given to a place. But who was going to look for the history behind these names? The train continued to chug on its way. Suddenly, I could feel someone tugging at my shirt. I turned to find that Lal Mohan Babu had gone visibly pale. When he caught my eye, he swallowed and whispered, "Blood." Blood? What was the man talking about? Lal Mohan Babu's eyes turned to the Rajasthani. The latter was fast asleep. His head was flung back, his mouth slightly open. My eyes fell on the foot on the bench. The skin around the big toe was badly grazed. It had obviously been bleeding, but now the blood had dried. Then I realized something else. The dark stains on his clothes, which appeared to be mud stains, were in fact patches of dried blood. I looked quickly at Feluda. He was reading his book, quite unconcerned. Lal Mohan Babu found his nonchalance too much to bear. He spoke again, in the same choked voice. "Mr. Mitter, suspicious blood marks on our new co-passenger." Feluda looked up, glanced once at the Rajasthani and said, "Probably caused by bugs." The thought that the blood was simply the result of bites from bedbugs made Lal Mohan Babu look like a pricked balloon. Even so, he could not relax. He continued to sit stiffly and frown and cast the Rajasthani sidelong glances from time to time. The train reached Marwar Junction at 2:30. We had lunch in the refreshment room and spent almost an hour walking about on the platform. When we climbed into another train at 3:30 to go to Jodhpur, there was no sign of that Rajasthani wearing a red shirt. Our journey to Jodhpur lasted for 2.5 hours. On the way, we saw several groups of camels. Each time that happened, Lal Mohan Babu grew most excited. By the time we reached Jodhpur, it was 6:10. Our train was delayed by 20 minutes. If we were still in Calcutta, the sun would have set by now. But as we were in the western part of the country, it was still shining brightly. We had booked rooms at the Circuit House. Lal Mohan Babu said he would stay at the New Bombay Lodge. "I'll join you early tomorrow morning. We can all go together to see the fort," he said, and went off towards the tongas that were standing in a row. We found ourselves a taxi and left the station. The Circuit House wasn't far, we were told. As we drove through the streets, I noticed a huge wall, visible through the gaps between houses, that seemed as high as a 2-storied house. There was a time, Feluda told me, when the whole of Jodhpur was surrounded by that wall. There were gates in 7 different places. If they heard of anyone coming to attack Jodhpur, all 7 gates were closed. Our car went around a bend. Feluda said at once, "Look, on your left." In the far distance, high above all the buildings in the city, stood a sprawling, sombre-looking fort, the famous fort of Jodhpur. Its rulers had once fought for the Mughals. I was still wondering how soon I would get to see the fort at close quarters when we reached the Circuit House. Our taxi passed through the gate, drove up the driveway, past a garden, and stopped under a portico. We got out, collected our luggage, and paid the driver. A gentleman emerged from the building and asked us if we were from Calcutta, and whether Feluda was called Pradosh Mitter. "Yes, that's right," Feluda acknowledged. "There is a double room booked in your name on the ground floor," the man replied. We were handed the visitor's book to sign. Only a few lines above our own names, we saw 2 entries, Dr. H.B. Hajra and Master M. Dar. The Circuit House was built on a simple plan. There was a large open space as one entered. To its left were the reception and the manager's room. In front of it was a staircase going up to the first floor, and on both sides there were wide corridors along which stood rows of rooms. There were wicker chairs in the corridors. A bearer came and picked up our luggage, and we followed him down the right-hand corridor to find room number 3. A middle-aged man, sporting an impressive moustache, was seated on one of the wicker chairs, chatting with a man in a Rajasthani cap. As we walked past them, the first man said, "Are you Bengalis?" Feluda smiled and said, "Yes." We were then shown into our room. It was quite spacious. There were twin beds, each with a mosquito net. Set apart at one end was a 2-seater sofa, a pair of easy chairs, and a round table with an ashtray on it. There was also a dressing table, wardrobes, and bedside tables. Lamps, glasses, and flasks of water were placed upon the tables. The doors to the attached bathroom was to the left. Feluda asked the bearer to bring us some tea and switch the fan on. "Did you see those 2 names?" he asked, sitting down on the sofa. "Yes, but I hope that man with the thick moustache isn't Dr. Hajra," I replied. "Why? What if he is? Why should it matter?" I couldn't immediately think of a good reason. Feluda saw me hesitate and said, "You didn't like the man, did you?" You want Dr. Hajra to be a pleasant, cheerful and friendly man, right? Yes, Felida was absolutely right. The man we just met appeared kind of crafty. Besides, he was probably quite tall and hefty. That was not how I would picture a doctor. The tea arrived just as Feluda finished a cigarette. The bearer placed the tray on the table and left. Someone knocked on our door almost at once. "Come in," said Feluda in a grand manner, sounding like an Englishman. The man with the moustache moved aside the curtain and came in. "I'm not disturbing you, am I?" he said. "No, not at all. Please sit down. Would you like a cup of tea?" "No, thanks. I've just had some. Frankly speaking, the tea here isn't all that good. But then, that's true of most places. India's the land of tea. Yet how many hotels or duck bungalows or circuit houses serve good quality tea? Tell me. But if you go abroad, it's a different story. Even in a place like Albania, I have had very good tea. Would you believe it? First-class Darjeeling tea, it was. And if you went to Europe, every major city would give you good tea. The only thing I don't like is the business of tea bags. Your cup is filled with hot water, and you're handed a little bag packed with tea leaves. A piece of string is tied to this bag. You have to hold it by the string and dip it in the water to make your own tea. Then you might add milk to it, or squeeze a lemon, as you wish. Personally, I prefer lemon tea. But you need really good tea for that. The kind of tea they have here is very ordinary." "You have travelled a lot, have you?" Feluda asked. "Yes, that's all I've done in life," our visitor replied. "I am what you might call a globe-trotter, and I'm fond of hunting. I got interested when I was in Africa. My name is Mandar Bose." I had heard of the globetrotter Umesh Bhattacharya, but not of Mandar Bose. He probably guessed what I was thinking. "I don't suppose my name will mean anything to you," he said. "When I first left home, my name appeared in the press, but that was 36 years ago. I've been back in India for only 3 months." "Really? I must say your Bengali has remained pretty good, considering you've been out of the country for so long." "Well, that's something entirely up to the person who's travelling abroad. If you want to forget your own language, you can do so in just 3 months. And if you don't, you will not forget it even in 30 years. But I was lucky in that I came across other Bengalis frequently. When I was in Kenya, I ran a business trading in ivory. My partner there was a Bengali. We worked together for almost 7 years. "Is there any other Bengali here in the circuit house?" asked Feluda. I had noticed earlier that he seldom wasted time on idle chit-chat. "Yes, that's what I find so surprising. But one thing's become clear to me. People in Calcutta are fed up, so they get out whenever they can. This man here, though, has come with a purpose. He's a psychologist. It's all a bit complicated. There's a little boy with him, about 8 years old. He's supposed to be able to recall his previous life. Says he was born in some fort in Rajasthan, once upon a time. This man is roaming around everywhere with the boy, looking for that fort. What I can't tell is whether this psychologist is a fraud, or the boy is simply telling a pack of lies. His behavior is certainly odd. He doesn't talk properly with anyone. Doesn't answer questions. Very fishy. I've seen a lot of cheats and frauds all over the world. Never thought I'd come across something like this back in my own country. Was it your globetrotting that brought you here? Mr. Bose smiled and stood up. To tell you the truth, I haven't yet seen much of this country. By the way, I didn't catch your names. Feluda made the introductions. And I have never stepped out of this country, he added. I see. Well, if you come to the dining hall at around 8:30, we'll meet again. I believe in early to bed and early to rise, you see. We left our room with Mr. Bose and emerged into the corridor outside. A taxi was coming in through the gate. It stopped under the portico, and a man of about 40 got out of it, accompanied by a thin little boy. I did not have to be told that they were Dr. Hemanga Hajra and Mukul Dhar. Chapter 5. Mr. Bose said good evening to Dr. Hajra as he passed him, and went towards his own room. Dr. Hajra began walking down the corridor, holding the boy by the hand. Then he saw us and stopped, looking a little confused. Perhaps the sight of two strangers had startled him. Feluda smiled and greeted him. Namaskar. Dr. Hajra, I presume? He asked. Yes, but I don't think I... Feluda took out one of his cards from his pocket and handed it to Dr. Hajra. I need to talk to you. To tell you the truth, we are here at Mr. Dhar's request. He has written you a letter. Oh, I see. Mukul, why don't you go to your room? I'll have a chat with these people, then I'll join you. All right? I'll go to the garden, said Mukul. His voice sounded as sweet as a flute, but his tone was flat and lifeless, almost as if the words had been spoken by a robo. Dr. Hajra said, Very well. You may go to the garden, but be a good boy and don't go out of the gate, okay? Mukul jumped from the corridor straight onto the gravel path without saying another word. Then he stepped over a row of flowers and stood quietly on the lawn. Dr. Hajra turned back to us, gave a somewhat embarrassed smile and asked, Where should we sit? Let's go to our room. The hair around Dr. Hajra's ears had started to grey, I noticed. His eyes held a sharp, intelligent look. Now that I could see him more closely, he appeared older, probably in his late 40s. When we were seated, Feluda handed him Mr. Dhar's letter and offered him a charminer. Dr. Hajra smiled, said, No thanks, and began reading the letter. When he had finished, he folded it and put it back in its envelope. Feluda explained quickly about Neelu being kidnapped. Mr. Dhar was afraid, he said, that those men might have followed Mukul and arrived here. That is why he came to see me. In fact, I'm here really because he wanted me to join you. But even if nothing untoward happens and you do not require my protection, I can see that my visit will not go to waste, as I've always wanted to see Rajasthan. Dr. Hajra remained thoughtful for a few moments. Then he said, Fortunately, nothing has happened as yet that might be seen as untoward. But honestly, there was no need to talk to a press reporter and say so much. I told Mr. Dhar to wait until I finished my investigation, and then he could get Mukul to speak to as many reporters as he liked, especially about the hidden treasure. I might think the story is possibly quite baseless, but there might well be people who would easily be tempted to go and look for it. What do you think of this whole business of recalling previous lives? Do you really believe in Jyotismars? What I think amounts to shooting arrows in the dark or simply making guesses. Yet I cannot dismiss the idea as pure nonsense. After all, there have been similar cases in the past. What those people could recall turned out to be accurate, to the last detail. That is why, when I heard about Mukul, I decided to do a thorough investigation. If it turned out that everything Mukul could recall was true, then I would treat his case as a starting point and base my future research on it. Have you made any progress? One thing has become clear. I was right to think about Rajasthan and bring him here. Mukul's entire demeanour has changed from the moment we set foot in Rajasthan. Just think. For the first time in his life, he was away from his parents and others in his family and travelling with a virtual stranger. Yet he hasn't mentioned his own people even once in the last few days. How is his relationship with you? We have had no problems. He sees me as someone who's taking him to his dreamland. All he can think of is his golden fortress. So he jumps with joy each time he sees a fort. Any sign of the golden fortress? Dr. Hajra shook his head. No, I'm afraid not. On our way here, I took him to the fort in Kisangar. Yesterday evening, he saw the Jodhpur fort from outside. Today, we went to Barmer. Every time he says, "No, not this one. Let's find another." One really needs patience in a case like this. I know there's no point in taking him to Chittor or Udaipur because there is no sand near those places. Mukul keeps talking of sand, and that's to be found only in these parts. So I'm thinking of going to Bikaner tomorrow. Would you mind if we came along? No, of course not. In fact, I'd feel quite reassured if you were with us, because something happened. Dr. Hajra stopped. Feluda had taken out his packet of cigarettes, but did not open it. Yesterday evening, Dr. Hajra spoke slowly. There was a phone call. Where? Here, in the circuit house. I wasn't here. Mukul and I were out looking at the fort. In our absence, someone rang to ask if a man had arrived from Calcutta with a small boy. Naturally, the manager said yes. But, Feluda suggested, it could be that some of the locals know about the press report that appeared in Calcutta and simply wanted to verify it. After all, there are plenty of Bengalis in Jodhpur, aren't there? Surely a little curiosity in a matter like this is natural? Yes, I can see that. But the question is, why didn't that man come here and meet me, or get in touch, even when he heard that I was here? Perhaps it's best that you and I stay together, and don't let Mukul go out on his own. Are you mad? Of course I won't. Dr. Hajra rose. I have booked a taxi for tomorrow. As there are just the two of you, we'll manage quite easily in one taxi. He began moving towards the door. Suddenly, Feluda asked a question rather unexpectedly. By the way, weren't you involved in a case in Chicago about 4 years ago? Dr. Hajra frowned. A case? Yes, I've been to Chicago, but... Something to do with the spiritual healing center? Dr. Hajra burst out laughing. Ha! Are you talking about Swami Bhavananda? The Americans used to call him Bhavanyanda. Yes, there was a case, but what was reported in the press was grossly exaggerated. The man was certainly a cheat, but you will find similar cheats among quacks of all kinds. It was small-time stuff, no more. In fact, his patients caught him out, and the news spread. Reporters from the press came to me for my opinion. I said very little and tried to play things down. But those reporters blew everything out of proportion. Afterwards, I happened to meet Bhavananda. I explained the whole matter to him myself, and we parted as friends. Thank you. What I read in the papers told me something quite different. We went out of the room together with Dr. Hajra. It was dark outside. Although the western sky was still glowing red, the street lights had come on. But where was Mukul? He was last seen in the garden, but now he wasn't there. Dr. Hajra had a quick look in his room and came out, looking concerned. Where's that boy gone? He said, and climbed down from the corridor onto the gravel path. We followed him. Mukul was certainly not in the garden. Mukul? Dr. Hajra called. Mukul! Yes, he has heard you. He is coming, said Feluda. In the twilight, I could see Mukul coming back from the road outside and turn into the gate. At the same time, I saw a man on the opposite pavement, walking briskly towards the new palace on the eastern side. I did not see his face, but could see, even in the dark, that the color of his shirt was bright red. Had Feluda seen him? Mukul came towards us. Dr. Hajra went to him, his arms outstretched, a smile on his lips. Then he said gently, You shouldn't go out like that. Why not? Asked Mukul coldly. You don't know this place. There are so many bad people about. I know him. Who? Mukul pointed at the road. That man who was here. Dr. Hajra placed a hand on his shoulder and turned to Feluda. That's the trouble, you see, he said. It's difficult to say whether he's talking of someone he really knows in this life or whether he's still talking about his previous life. I noticed a shiny piece of paper in Mukul's hand. Feluda had seen it too. He said, May I see that piece of paper you're holding? Mukul handed it to Feluda. It was a piece of golden foil, about 2 inches long and half an inch wide. Where did you find it? Over there. Mukul pointed at the grass. May I keep it? Asked Feluda. No, I found it. Mukul's voice hadn't changed. His tone was just as cold and as flat. Feluda was obliged to return the piece of foil to him. Dr. Hajra said, Come on, Mukul. Let's go to our room. We'll have a wash, and then we'll both go and have dinner. Good night, Mr. Mitter. Early breakfast at 7:30 tomorrow morning, and then we'll leave. Feluda wrote a postcard to Mr. Dhar with news of Mukul's welfare before we went to the dining hall. By the time we got there after a shower, Dr. Hajra and Mukul had returned to their room. Mandar Bose was sitting in the opposite corner, having his pudding with the Marwari gentleman he had been talking to earlier. They finished their meal and rose as we were served our soup. Mr. Bose raised his hand and said, "Good night," as he went out through the door. After 2 nights on the train, I was feeling quite tired. All I wanted to do after dinner was go to sleep. But Feluda made me stay awake for a while. He took out his blue notebook and sat on the sofa. I was lying in my bed. We had a cream to ward off mosquitoes, so there was no need to use the mosquito net. Feluda pushed the little button of his ballpoint pen, got it ready to write, and said, "Who have we met so far? Give me the whole list." Starting from Mr. Dhar's arrival. Okay, Sudhir Dhar, that's number 1. Then Shivratan. Then Nilu. Oh, Shivratan's servant. What was his name? Can't remember. Manohar. Next, Jatayu. What's his real name? Lalmohan. Surname? His surname is Ganguly. Good. Feluda continued to write as I proceeded with my list. Then we saw that man in the red shirt. Did we actually meet him? Get to know him? No. All right, go on. Mandar Bose and that other gentleman. And then we met Mukul Dhar. Dr. Feluda. My sudden scream made Feluda stop in mid-sentence. My eyes had fallen on Feluda's bed. An ugly, creepy creature was trying to slip out from under his pillow. I pointed at it. Feluda sprang to his feet, moved quickly and removed the pillow. A scorpion lay on the bed. Feluda pulled the bedsheet off in one swift motion, and the scorpion fell on the ground. Then he grabbed his chappal and smacked it 3 times with all his might. After that, he tore off a piece from a newspaper, picked up the crushed creature with it, and went into the bathroom. I saw him crumple the whole thing into a ball and throw it out of the back door. He came back to our room and said, "The door which the cleaners use was left open. That's how Mr. Scorpion got into our room. Anyway, go to sleep now. We have an early start tomorrow." But I could not dismiss the matter so easily. Something told me, but I put the thought out of my mind. If I kept thinking of possible danger, and if my telepathy was strong enough, it might just drag that danger closer. Who knew? It would be far better to try and sleep. Chapter 6. The following morning, as soon as I emerged from our room, I heard a familiar voice say, "Good morning." It was Jatayu. Feluda was already seated on a chair on the corridor outside, waiting for his tea. Jatayu glanced round excitedly and said, "Oh, this is such a thrilling place, Mr. Mitter, full of powerfully suspicious characters." "You are unharmed, I hope?" Feluda asked. "Oh yes, I feel fitter than ever. This morning, you know what I did? I challenged the manager of our lodge to an arm wrestle, but the fellow didn't accept. Then he came a little closer and whispered, 'I have a weapon in my suitcase.' 'A catapult?' 'No, sir, a Nepali dagger. straight from Kathmandu. If I'm attacked, I'm going to stab my attacker with it. Push it straight into his stomach, I tell you. Then let's see what happens. I've always wanted to build up a collection of weapons, you know. I wanted to laugh again, but my self-control was getting better, so I managed to stop myself. Lalmohon Babu sat down on the chair next to Feluda and asked, "What's your plan today? Aren't you going to see the fort?" "Yes, but not the fort in Jodhpur. We are going to Bikaner." "Bikaner? Why Bikaner?" "We've got company. Somebody has arranged the car." Another voice said, "Good morning," from a different part of the corridor. Mr. Globetrotter was walking towards us. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. I caught Lalmohon Babu casting admiring glances at Mandar Bose's handsome moustache and muscular physique. Feluda introduced him to Mr. Bose. "Good heavens! A globetrotter!" Lalmohon Babu's eyes widened. "I must cultivate you, dear sir. You must have had a lot of hair-raising experiences." "Plenty, I can assure you. The only thing that I have missed is being boiled in a cannibal's cooking pot. Apart from that, I have had virtually every experience a man can possibly have." Suddenly, I noticed Mukul. I hadn't seen him come out on the corridor. He was standing quietly in a corner, staring at the garden. Then Dr. Hajra appeared, dressed and ready to go out. A flask was slung from one shoulder. From the other hung binoculars, and around his neck was the strap of his camera. He said, "It will take us almost 4.5 hours to get there. If you have a flask, take it with you. God knows if we'll get anything to drink on the way. But I've told the dining hall to give us 4 packed lunches." "Where are you off to?" asked Mandar Bose. On being told where we were going, he became all excited. "Why don't we all go together?" he asked. "What a good idea!" exclaimed Lalmohon Babu. Dr. Hajra looked a little uncomfortable. "Well then, how many are actually going?" he inquired. "Look, there is no question of all of us going in one car," Mr. Bose reassured him. "I will arrange another taxi. I think Mr. Maheshwari would also like to go with me." "Are you going too?" Dr. Hajra asked Lalmohon Babu. "If I go, I will pay my share. I don't want anyone else to pay for me. Tell you what, why don't you 4 go in one taxi? I'll go with Mr. Globetrotter." Obviously, Jatayu wanted to hear a few stories from Mr. Bose and perhaps get ideas for a new plot. He had already written at least 25 adventure stories. To be honest, his remark made me feel quite relieved. 5 in one car would have been cramped and uncomfortable. Mr. Bose spoke to the manager and booked a second taxi. Lalmohon Babu returned to New Bombay Lodge. "Please pick me up on your way," he said before he departed. "I'll be ready in half an hour." Before I describe anything else about our visit to Bikaner, perhaps I ought to mention that Mukul rejected the fort there as soon as he saw it. But that was not the highlight of our visit. Something far more important happened in Devikund, which proved that we were truly up against a ferocious foe. Nothing much happened on the way to Bikaner, except that we saw a group of gypsies. They were camping by the roadside. Mukul asked us to stop, got out of the car, and roamed among the gypsies for a while. Then he returned and declared that he knew those people. After that, Feluda and Dr. Hajra spoke about Mukul for a few minutes. I cannot tell whether he heard the conversation from the front seat. If he did, his demeanour gave nothing away. Dr. Hajra, Feluda began, when Mukul talks of his previous life, what exactly does he say? He mentions one thing repeatedly, a golden fortress. His house was apparently near that fortress. Gold and jewels were buried under the ground in that house. From the way he talks, it seems as if he was present when the treasure was buried. Apart from that, he talks of a battle. He says he saw a large number of elephants, horses, soldiers, guns, cannons. There was a lot of noise, and people were screaming. And he talks of camels, says he has ridden camels. Then he talks of peacocks. Once a peacock had attacked him, pecked his hand so hard that it began bleeding. There is something else he mentions frequently, sand. Haven't you noticed how animated he becomes when he sees sand? We reached Bikaner at 11:45. The road began going uphill a little before we reached the city, which was surrounded by a wall on top of the hill. The most striking building there was a huge fort, made of red sandstone. Our car drove straight to the fort. As it got closer, the fort appeared to grow bigger. Baba was right. The appearance of the forts in Rajasthan was a good indicator of the might of the Rajputs. As soon as our taxi drew up at the entrance, Mukul said, "Why have we stopped here?" Dr. Hajra asked him, "Does this fort seem familiar, Mukul?" Mukul replied solemnly, "No, this is a stupid fort, not the golden one." By this time, we had all climbed out of the car. Just as Mukul finished speaking, a harsh raucous sound reached our ears. At once, Mukul ran to Dr. Hajra and flung his arms around him. The sound had come from a park opposite the fort. "That was a peacock. Has this happened before?" asked Feluda. Dr. Hajra stroked Mukul's head gently. "Yes, it happened yesterday at Jodhpur. He can't stand peacocks." Mukul had turned quite pale. "I don't want to stay here," he said, in the same lifeless yet sweet voice. Dr. Hajra turned to Feluda. "I'm going to take the car and go to the local circuit house. Then I will send it back here. Why don't you two see whatever you want to? You can join me at the circuit house when the car comes back to pick you up. But please make sure we leave here by 2:00, or it will be late by the time we get back to Jodhpur." There was a reason to feel disappointed, particularly for Dr. Hajra, but I didn't mind all that much. I was about to step into a Rajasthani fort for the first time in my life. The thought was giving me goose pimples. We proceeded towards the main gate of the fort. Suddenly, Feluda stopped and laid a hand on my shoulder. "Did you see?" "What?" "That man." Was he referring to the man in the red shirt? I followed his gaze, but could not spot a single red shirt anywhere. There were lots of people milling about, for there was a small market just outside the fort. "Where is he?" I asked. "Idiot! Are you looking for a red shirt?" "Yes. Shouldn't I? Who are you talking about?" "You're the biggest fool on earth. All you remember is the shirt, nothing else. It was the same man. He was wearing a shawl and most of his face was covered, all except his eyes. But today he had a blue shirt on. When we stopped to look at those gypsies, I saw a taxi going towards Bikaner. That's when I spotted that blue shirt. But what is it doing here? If we knew that, there would be no mystery. The man had vanished. I passed through the gate and entered the fort, feeling rather agitated. A large courtyard greeted me. The fort stood proudly to the right. There were pigeons everywhere, in every niche in the wall. 1,000 years ago, Bikaner was a thriving city, but it had disappeared under the sand. Feluda told me that 400 years ago, Raja Rai Singh began building the fort. He was a famous leader in Akbar's army. Something had been bothering me for a while. Why hadn't Lalmohan Babu and the others arrived yet? Did they get late in setting out? Or had their car broken down on the way? Then I told myself not to worry. There was no point in spoiling the joy of seeing an amazing historical site. What struck me as most amazing was the armory. Not only did it contain weapons, but also a very beautiful silver throne, called Alam Ambali. It was said to be a gift from a Mughal Badshah. Apart from that, there were swords, spears, daggers, shields, armors, helmets. There was no end to the weapons. The swords were so large and so strong that it seemed incredible that they were meant to be used by human beings. The sight of those weapons reminded me of Jatayu again. Funnily enough, as soon as I thought of him, he arrived, possibly dragged by the force of my telepathy. In that huge room in the massive fort, standing near a very large door, Jatayu looked smaller and more comical than ever. When he saw us, he grinned, looked around, and simply said, "Was every Rajput a giant? Surely these things weren't made to be used by ordinary men?" It turned out that my hunch was right. They had traveled for about 70 kilometers when their taxi got a flat tire. "Where are the other two?" Feluda asked. "They stopped to buy things in the market. I couldn't wait any longer, so I came in." We left the armory and went off to see Phool Mahal, Gaj Mandir, Sheesh Mahal, and Ganga Nivas. When we got to Chini Burj, we saw Mandar Bose and Mr. Maheshwari. They were both clutching parcels wrapped with newspaper, so clearly they had done some shopping. Mr. Bose said, "The weapons I saw in the forts and castles in Europe, all built in medieval times, and the weapons I have seen here today, all prove one thing. The human race is becoming weaker every day, and smaller in size." "Like me, you mean?" Lalmohan Babu remarked with a smile. "Right, exactly like you," Mr. Bose replied. "I don't think a single Rajput would have matched your dimensions in the 16th century. Oh, by the way," he turned to Feluda, "this was waiting for you at the reception desk in the circuit house." He took out a sealed envelope from his pocket and passed it to Feluda. It had no stamp on it. Someone must have delivered it by hand. "Who gave it to you?" Feluda asked, opening the envelope. "Bagri, the fellow who sits at the reception desk. He handed it to me just as we were leaving. Said he had no idea who had dropped it off." "Excuse me," said Feluda. Then he read the note, replaced it in the envelope, and put it in his pocket. I could not tell what it said, nor could I ask. We spent another half an hour in the fort. Then Feluda looked at his watch and said, "Time to go to the circuit house." I didn't want to leave the fort, but knew I had to. Both taxis were waiting outside. This time, we decided to leave together. As we were getting into ours, the driver told us that Dr. Hajra and Mukul had not gone to the circuit house. Apparently, Mukul had declared that he had no wish to go there. "So where did they go?" "Devikund," said the driver. "Where was that?" "Not far from Bikaner, it turned out." Feluda said there were cenotaphs there, locally known as chhatris, built as memorials to Rajput warriors. We had to travel 5 miles, and it took us 10 minutes. Devikund really was beautiful, as were the cenotaphs. Each cenotaph had stone columns that rose from stone platforms, supporting a small canopy, also made of stone. The whole structure, from top to bottom, was exquisitely carved. There were at least 50 such cenotaphs spread over the whole area. There were plenty of trees, all of them full of parrots. The birds were flocking together on some, or flitting from one tree to another, crying raucously. I had never seen so many parrots in one place. But where was Dr. Hajra? And Mukul? Lal Mohan Babu was getting restless. "Very suspicious and mysterious," he exclaimed. "Dr. Hajra!" shouted Mandar Bose. His deep booming voice made a number of parrots take flight, but no one answered. We began a search. There were so many cenotaphs that the place was like a maze. As we roamed amongst them, I saw Feluda pick up a matchbox from the grass and put it in his pocket. In the end, it was Lal Mohan Babu who found Dr. Hajra. We heard him shout and ran to join him. Under a mango tree, in front of a mossy platform, Dr. Hajra was lying crumpled on the ground. His mouth was gagged, and his hands were tied behind his back. He was groaning helplessly. Feluda bent over him quickly, removed the gag, and untied his hands. A torn piece of a turban had been used to cover his mouth. "How on earth did this happen?" asked Mr. Bose. Fortunately, Dr. Hajra was not injured. He sat up on the grass and panted for a while. Then he told us what had happened. "Mukul said he didn't want to go to the circuit house," he said, "so we just drove on. Then we happened to come here. Mukul liked the place. 'Those things are chhatris,' he said. He had seen them before, and he wanted a closer look. So we got out of the car. Mukul began exploring, and I stood in the shade under a tree. Suddenly someone attacked me from behind. He placed a hand over my mouth and knocked me down. I fell flat on my face. Then he pressed me down firmly. I think he kept his knee on the back of my head and tied my hands and then gagged my mouth. "Where's Mukul?" Feluda asked anxiously. "I don't know. I did hear a car start soon after I was tied up." "You didn't see this man's face?" Dr. Hajra shook his head. "No, but when we struggled, I got an idea of his clothes. He was wearing Rajasthani clothes, not a shirt and trousers." "There he is," shouted Mandar Bose. To my surprise, Mukul emerged from behind a chhatri, chewing a stalk of grass. Dr. Hajra let out an audible sigh of relief. "Thank God," he cried. "Where did you go, Mukul?" No answer. "Where were you all this while?" "Behind that," Mukul replied this time, pointing at a chhatri. "I have seen such things before." Feluda spoke next. "Did you see the man who was here?" "Which man?" Dr. Hajra intervened. Mukul could not have seen him. He ran off to explore the area the minute he got out of the car. I never imagined such a thing would happen in Bikaner, so I wasn't unduly worried about him. Even so, Feluda tried again. "Didn't you see the man who tied the doctor's hands?" "I want to see the Golden Fortress," said Mukul. It was clearly pointless to ask him anything else. "Let's not waste our time any more," Feluda spoke abruptly. "In a way, I'm glad that Mukul was nowhere near you, or that man might have made off with Mukul. If he has returned to Jodhpur, we might be able to catch up with him, if we drive fast enough." In 2 minutes, we were all back in our cars and speeding back to Jodhpur. This time, Lal Mohan Babu decided to join us. "Those men drink a lot. I can't stand the smell of alcohol," he confided. Our Punjabi driver, Harmit Singh, managed to drive at 60 miles per hour. At one point, a small bird flew into our windscreen and died. Mukul and I were sitting in the front with the driver. I turned around once to look at the 3 men in the back seat. Lal Mohan Babu was sitting crushed between Feluda and Dr. Hajra. His face looked pale and his eyes were closed. Nevertheless, a smile hovered on his lips, which told me that he could smell an adventure. Perhaps he had even thought of a plot for his next novel. We drove at that speed for 100 miles, but by that time it had become clear that the criminal had got away, and we wouldn't be able to catch up with him. After all, there was no reason to think that he wasn't travelling in a fast new car. When we reached Jodhpur, it was dark and all the lights in the city had been switched on. Feluda said to Lal Mohan Babu, "You would like to be dropped at the new Bombay Lodge, wouldn't you?" "Yes," Lal Mohan Babu squeaked. "I mean, all my things are there, so naturally. But I was wondering if, after dinner, I might go over to your place." "Very well," Feluda said reassuringly. "I will ask at the circuit house if they have a vacant room. You can ring me around 9. I should be able to tell you then." I was still mulling over all that had happened during the day. We were up against someone extremely clever and crafty. Of that there was no doubt. Was it the man in the red shirt who went to Bikaner today wearing a blue one? I didn't know. Nothing was making any sense to me. Perhaps Feluda was just as puzzled. If he had worked things out, his whole demeanor would have changed. Having spent so many years with him and watched his reactions, that was something I had learned to read quite well. Upon reaching the circuit house, we dispersed and went to our individual rooms. Before going to our room, Feluda said to Dr. Hajra, "If you don't mind, may I keep this with me?" In his hand was the torn piece of cloth with which Dr. Hajra had been tied. "Certainly," Dr. Hajra replied. Then he moved a little closer and lowered his voice. "As you can see, Mr. Mitter, the situation is now quite serious. This is exactly what you were afraid of, isn't it? I must say I hadn't anticipated such trouble." "Don't worry," Feluda told him. "You carry on with your work. I am going to be with you. If you had gone straight to the circuit house in Bikaner today, I don't think there would have been any problem. Fortunately, whoever attacked you could not kidnap Mukul. That's the main thing. From now on, stay close to us. That should minimize the chances of something similar happening again." Dr. Hajra continued to look troubled. He said, "I'm not worried about myself, you see. If a scientist has to do research, he has to take certain risks just to complete his work. I'm worried about you two. You are outsiders, not involved in this case at all." Feluda smiled. "You must assume that I too am a scientist involved in some research, and so I'm taking risks as well." Mukul was pacing up and down the corridor. Dr. Hajra called him, said good night to us, and went to his room with Mukul. He was still looking preoccupied. We went to ours. Feluda called a bearer and ordered 2 Coca-Colas. Then he took out his cigarettes and lighter from his pocket and placed them on the table. He was looking worried. From a different pocket, he took out the matchbox he had found in Devikund. It had an ace printed on one side, and it was empty. Feluda stared at it for a few moments before saying, "We stopped at so many stations on the way to Jodhpur, and you saw so many pawn stalls selling matches and cigarettes. Did you notice any of them selling this particular brand of matches?" I had to admit the truth. "No, Feluda, I didn't notice anything. In Western India, this brand with the ace on it is not sold anywhere. Certainly not in Rajasthan. This matchbox has come from a different state." "Does that mean it doesn't belong to the man in the red shirt?" "That is a foolish question. To start with, if a man is dressed as a Rajasthani, that doesn't automatically mean that he is one. Anyone can wear Rajasthani clothes. Secondly, plenty of other people could have gone to Devikund and attacked Dr. Hajra." "Yes, of course. But we don't know who they are, do we? So what's the use of wondering about that?" "See? You are speaking without thinking again. Lalmohan, Mandar Bose, and Maheshwari, all 3 men reached the Bikaner fort quite late. Just think about that. Besides—" "Oh, yes. Now I can see what you mean. It just hadn't occurred to me before. Lalmohan Babu told us that their car had a flat tire, which delayed them by 45 minutes. What if he had lied? Even if he had told the truth and was quite innocent, Mandar Bose and Maheshwari could well have gone to Devikund instead of going to the local market." Feluda let out a deep sigh and took out another object from his pocket. My heart gave a sudden lurch. I had totally forgotten about it. It was the letter Mandar Bose had handed him that morning. "Who wrote that letter, Feluda?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No idea," Feluda replied, passing it to me. Only one line was written in large letters with a ballpoint pen. "If you value your life, go back to Calcutta immediately." The note shook in my hand. I put it quickly on the table and placed my hands on my lap, trying to steady them. "What are you going to do, Feluda?" Feluda was staring at the ceiling fan. His eyes remained fixed on it as he muttered, almost to himself, "A spider's web." Geometry. It is dark now, so you can't see it. But when the sun rises, the web will catch its light. It will glitter, and then you can see its pattern. Now, all we have to do is wait for sunrise. Chapter 7. I woke for a few moments in the middle of the night. God knows what time it was, and saw Feluda scribbling something in his blue notebook, by the light of the bedside lamp. I don't know how long he stayed awake, but when I woke at 6:30, he had showered, had a shave, and was dressed to go out. According to him, when your brain works at high speed, you tend to sleep a lot less, but that does not affect your health. At least, that's what he believes. In the last 10 years, I have not known him to be ill, even for a single day. Even here in Jodhpur, he was doing yoga every day. By the time I left my bed, he had finished his exercises. When we went to the dining room for breakfast, we met everyone else. Lal Mohan Babu had moved to the circuit house the previous night. He had been given a room only 2 doors away, Mandar Bose. We found him eating an omelette. He had thought of a wonderful plot, he told us. Dr. Hajra still seemed upset. He had not slept well. Only Mukul seemed totally unperturbed. Mandar Bose decided to be direct with Dr. Hajra. "Please don't mind my saying this," he began, "but you're dealing with such a weird subject that you're bound to invite trouble. In a country where superstition runs rife, isn't it better not to meddle with such things? One day, you will find little boys in every household claiming to be Jatismars. If you look closely, you will find that their parents want a little publicity. That's all there is to it. But what are you going to do if that happens? How many kids will you take with you and travel all over the country?" Dr. Hajra made no comment. Lal Mohan Babu simply cast puzzled glances from one to the other, for no one had told him about Mukul being able to recall his past life. Feluda had already told me that after breakfast he wanted to go to the main market. I knew he had some other motive. It could not be just to see more of the city or to shop. We left at 7:15, accompanied by Lal Mohan Babu. I tried a couple of times to imagine him as a ferocious foe, but the mere idea was so laughable that I had to wipe it from my mind. The area around the circuit house was quiet, but the main city turned out to be noisy and congested. The old wall was visible from virtually every corner. Along that wall stood rows of shops, tongas, houses, and much else. Remnants of a 500-year-old city were now inextricably tangled with the modern Jodhpur. We walked through the bazaar, looking at various shops. I could tell Feluda was looking for something specific, but I had no idea what it was. Suddenly, Lal Mohan Babu asked, "What is Dr. Hajra's subject? I mean, what is he a doctor of?" "This morning, Mr. Trotter was saying something." "Hajra is a parapsychologist," Feluda replied. "Parapsychologist?" Lal Mohan Babu frowned. "I didn't know you could add para before psychologist. I know you can do that to typhoid. So does it mean it's half psychology? Just as paratyphoid is half typhoid?" "No. In this case, para means abnormal, not half. Psychology is a complex subject, in any case. Parapsychology deals with its more obscure aspects. I see. And what was all that about a Jatismar? Mukul is a Jatismar. At least, that's what he has been called. Lal Mohan Babu's jaw fell open. You'll get plenty of material for a plot, Feluda continued. That young boy talks of a golden fortress he saw in a previous life, and the house where he lived had hidden treasure, buried under the ground. Are we going to look for those things? Lal Mohan Babu's voice grew hoarse. I don't know about you. We certainly are. Lal Mohan Babu stopped, bang in the middle of the road, and grasped Feluda's hand with both his own. Mr. Mitter, this is the chance of a lifetime. Please don't disappear anywhere without taking me with you. That's my only request. But I don't know where we are going next. Nothing's decided. Lal Mohan Babu paused for a while, deep in thought. Then he said, Will Mr. Trotter go with you? Why? Would you mind if he did? That man is powerfully suspicious. There was a stall by the roadside, selling nagras. Most people in Rajasthan wear these shoes. Feluda stopped at the stall. Powerful he might be. Why suspicious? He asked. When we were travelling to Bikaner yesterday, he was bragging a lot in the car. Said he had shot a wolf in Tanganyika. Yet I know that there are no wolves anywhere in Africa. I have read books by Martin Johnson. No one can fool me that easily. So what did you say? What could I say? I could hardly call him a liar to his face. I was sitting sandwiched between these two men. You have seen how broad his chest is, haven't you? At least 45 inches. Both sides of the road were lined with huge cactus bushes and prickly pear. If I dared to contradict him, he would have picked me up and thrown me behind one of those bushes, and then, in no time, I would have turned into fodder for vultures. Great squadrons of vultures would have landed on me and had a feast. You think so? How many vultures could possibly feed on your corpse? Ha 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 ha. Feluda had, in the meantime, taken off his sandals and put on a pair of nagras. He was walking back and forth in front of the stall. Very powerful shoes. Are you going to buy those? Lal Mohan Babu asked. Why don't you try a pair yourself? Feluda suggested. None of the shoes were small enough to fit Lal Mohan Babu, but he did slip his feet into the smallest pair that he could find, and gave a shudder. Oh my God! This was made from the hide of a rhino. You would have to be a rhino yourself to wear such shoes. In that case, you must assume that 90% of Rajasthanis are rhinos. Both men took the nagras off and wore their own shoes again. Even the shopkeeper began laughing, having realized that the Babus from the city were having a little joke. We left the stall and walked on. From a pawn shop, a film song was being played very loudly on a radio. That reminded me of Durga Puja in Calcutta. Over here, people celebrated not Durga Puja, but Dussehra. But that was a long way away. A few minutes later, Feluda suddenly stopped at a shop selling stoneware. It was a prosperous-looking shop called Solanki Stores. Displayed in the showcase were beautiful pots, bowls, plates, and glasses, all made of stone. Feluda was staring at those fixedly. The shopkeeper saw us, came to the door, and invited us into his shop. Feluda pointed at a bowl in the glass case and said, "May I see it, please?" The shopkeeper did not pick up the bowl that was displayed. Instead, he took out an identical one from a cupboard. It was beautiful, made of yellow stone. I couldn't remember having seen anything like it before. "Was this made here?" Feluda asked. "It was made in Rajasthan, but not in Jodhpur." "No? Where was it made then?" "Jaisalmer. This yellow stone can be found only in Jaisalmer." "I see." I had heard of Jaisalmer, but only vaguely. I didn't know where exactly in Rajasthan it was. Feluda bought the bowl. Then we took a tonga back to the circuit house. It was 9:30 by the time we returned, after a most bumpy ride. But it did mean that, after such a journey, our breakfast was certainly digested. Mandar Bose was sitting outside in the corridor, reading a newspaper. "What did you buy?" he asked, looking at the packet in Feluda's hand. "A bowl. After all, I must have a Rajasthani memento." "I saw your friend go out." "Who? Dr. Hajra?" "Yes. I saw him leave in a taxi at around 9 o'clock. "And Mukul?" "He went with him. Perhaps they have gone to talk to the police. After what happened yesterday, Hajra must still be quite shaken." Lal Mohan Babu returned to his room, on the grounds that he had to work on his new plot and change a little. We went to ours. "Why did you suddenly buy that bowl, Feluda?" I asked. Feluda sat down on the sofa, unwrapped the bowl and placed it on the table. "There is something special about it," he said. "What's so special?" "Here is a bowl made of stone. Yet, if I were to say it was a golden bowl, I wouldn't be far wrong. I have never seen anything like this in my life." After this, he lapsed into silence and began turning the pages of a railway timetable. There was little that I could do. I knew Feluda wouldn't open his mouth, at least for an hour. Even if I asked him questions, he wouldn't answer. So I left the room. The corridor was now empty. Mandar Bose had gone. So had the European lady who had been sitting at the far end earlier on. The sound of a drum reached my ears. Then someone started singing. I looked at the gate and found a boy and a girl who looked like beggars. The boy was beating the drum and the girl was singing. They were walking towards the corridor. I went forward. When I reached the open space, suddenly I felt like going upstairs. I had been walking past the staircase every day. I knew there was a terrace upstairs, but hadn't yet seen it. So I climbed up the steps. There were 4 rooms upstairs. To the east and west of these was an open terrace. The rooms appeared to be unoccupied. Or it could be that the occupants had all gone out. I went to the western side. The fort was clearly visible from here, looking quite majestic. The 2 beggars downstairs were still singing. The tune of their song sounded familiar. Where had I heard it before? Suddenly I realized it was very similar to the tune I had heard Mukul hum at times. The same tune was being repeated every now and then, but it did not sound monotonous. I went closer to the low wall that surrounded the terrace. It overlooked the rear portion of the circuit house. There was a garden at the back as well. I was considerably surprised to see it. All I had seen from one of the windows in our room was a single juniper tree standing at the back, but that gave no indication that there were so many trees spread over such a large area. What was that bright blue object glittering behind the tree? Oh, it was a peacock. Most of its body was hidden behind the tree, so at first I couldn't see it properly. Now it emerged and was pecking the ground. Was it looking for worms? As far as I knew, peacocks ate insects. Suddenly something I had once read about peacocks came back to me. It is always difficult to find a peacock's nest. Apparently, they manage to choose the most inaccessible spots to lay their eggs and raise their young. The peacock was moving forward, taking slow, measured steps, craning its neck and occasionally looking around. Its long tail followed the movement of its body. Suddenly, the peacock stopped. It craned its neck to the right. What had it seen? Or had it heard something? The peacock moved away. Something had disturbed it. It was a man, standing right below the spot where I was. I could see him through the gaps in the trees. The man had a turban on his head. It wasn't very large. He had wrapped a white shawl around himself. As I was standing above him, I could not see his face. All I could see were his turban and his shoulders. His arms were hidden under the shawl. He began walking stealthily, moving from the western side of the building. I was on the terrace facing the west. Our room was on the ground floor, in the opposite direction. I wanted to see where the man was going. So I ran past the rooms in the middle of the terrace and leant over the wall on the eastern side. The man was standing below me once again. If he looked up, he would see me, but he didn't. He was creeping closer to our room, to one of its windows. Then one of his hands slipped out from under the shawl. What was that? Close to his wrist, glinting in the sun? The man stopped. My throat felt dry. Then he took another step forward. Suddenly, a loud, harsh sound broke the silence. The peacock had cried from somewhere. The man gave a violent start, and at the same moment I screamed, "Feluda!" The man in the turban turned and ran in the same direction from which he had come. He disappeared in a matter of seconds. I sprinted down the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time, ran along the corridor without stopping, crashed straight into Feluda at the door to our room, and stood there, stunned. Feluda pulled me inside and asked, "What's the matter? What happened?" I saw from the roof a man wearing a turban walking towards your window. What did he look like? Tall? Don't know. Saw him from a height, you see. On his hand was a what? Watch. I thought Feluda would either laugh the whole thing off or tease me by calling me an idiot and a coward. He did neither. Looking a little grim, he simply peered out of the window and looked around. Someone knocked on our door. "Come in." A bearer came in with coffee. "Salam, Saab." He placed the tray on the table and took out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to Feluda, saying, "Manager Saab asked me to give it to you." He left. Feluda read the note quickly, then flopped down on the sofa with an air of resignation. "Whose letter is that, Feluda?" "Read it." It was a short note from Dr. Hajra, written on a sheet of paper that has his name printed in a corner. It said, "I believe it is no longer safe for me to remain in Jodhpur. I am going somewhere else, where I hope to have better success. I see no reason to drag you and your cousin into further danger, so I'm leaving without saying goodbye. I wish you both all the very best. Yours, H.M. Hazra." "He has acted most hastily." Feluda spoke through clenched teeth. Then he made for the reception desk without even drinking his coffee. Today, we found a different man at the desk. "Did Dr. Hajra say where he was going to be back?" Feluda asked. "No, sir. He paid all his bills. Said nothing about coming back." "Do you know where he has gone?" "To the railway station. That's all I know." Feluda thought for a moment. Then he said, "It's possible to go to Jaisalmer by train from here, isn't it?" "Yes, sir. We have had a direct line for 2 years." "When is the train?" "It leaves at 10 o'clock at night." "Is there a train in the morning?" "Yes, but it goes only up to Pokhran. It should have left half an hour ago. One can go to Jaisalmer by this train if one can arrange a car from Pokhran." "How far is it from Pokhran?" 70 miles. "What other trains go to Jodhpur in the morning? I mean, to other destinations?" The man consulted a book, leafing through a few pages. "A train leaves for Barmer at 8 o'clock, and at 9 there is the Rewari passenger. That's all." Feluda's fingers beat an impatient tattoo on the counter. "Jaisalmer is about 200 miles from here, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "Could you please arrange a taxi for us? We would like to leave for Jaisalmer at 11:30. "Certainly, sir." The receptionist picked up a telephone. "Where are you off to?" asked a voice. It was Mandar Bose, coming out of his room with a suitcase in his hand. He had just had a shower and was smartly dressed. "I'd like to see the Thar Desert," Feluda replied. "Oh, so you are going to the northwest? I'm off to the east." "You are leaving Jodhpur too?" "My taxi should be here any minute. I don't like spending a very long time in any one place. Besides, if you leave as well, the circuit house will become empty in any case." The receptionist finished talking into the phone and turned to us. "It's arranged," he said. "Topshe," Feluda said to me, "go and see if you can find Lal Mohan Babu. Tell him we are going to Jaisalmer. If he wants to come with us, he should get ready immediately." I ran towards room number 10 It was not clear to me why we were suddenly going to Jaisalmer. Why did Feluda choose Jaisalmer, of all places? Was it because it was close to the desert? Had Dr. Hajra and Mukul also gone there? Did this mean that we were no longer in any danger? Or were we going to walk straight into it? Chapter 8. Pokhran was 120 miles from Jodhpur. Jaisalmer was another 70. It should not take more than 6 or 7 hours to cover 190 miles. Or, at least, that was what our driver, Gurbachan Singh, told us. He was a plump and cheerful Sikh. I saw him taking his hands off the steering wheel at times and clasping them behind his head. Then he would lean back in his seat and take a little rest. But the car stayed on course because Gurbachan rested the steering wheel on his fat stomach, even moving it when necessary, without putting his hands back on it. This action was actually not as difficult as it may sound, for there was virtually no traffic on the road. Besides, the road ran straight, without curves or bends, for as much as 5 or 6 miles in many places. Unless something went wrong, we would reach Jaisalmer by 6 o'clock in the evening. The scenery started to change when we were only 10 miles out of Jodhpur. I had never seen anything like it. Jodhpur had a number of hills around it. The fort there was made of red sandstone that came from those hills. But now, those hills disappeared and were replaced by an undulating terrain that stretched right up to the horizon. It was a mixture of grass, red earth, sand, and loose stones. Ordinary trees and plants had disappeared too. Now all I could see were acacia, cacti, and similar plants whose names I didn't know. The other thing I noticed was wild camels. They were roaming freely, like cattle and sheep. Some were light brown, like milky tea. Others had darker coats, closer to black coffee. I saw one of them munching on a thorny plant. Feluda said that the thorns frequently injured a camel's mouth, but since those bushes were its only source of food, the camel put up with the discomfort. Feluda also told me a little about Jaisalmer. It was built in the 12th century and became the capital of the Bhati Rajputs. Only 64 miles from there was the border between India and Pakistan. Even 10 years ago, going to Jaisalmer was quite difficult. There were no trains, and what roads there were often disappeared under the sand. The place was so dry that if it rained just for a day in a whole year, people thought they were lucky. When I asked him about battles, Feluda said Alauddin Khilji had once attacked Jaisalmer. We had travelled for nearly 90 kilometers, 56 miles, when purely out of the blue, we got a puncture, which made the car give an unpleasant shriek, lurch and come to a halt by the side of the road. I felt quite cross with Gurbachan Singh. He had assured us that he had checked the pressure in each tire and all was well. As a matter of fact, the car appeared to be new and in good condition. We got out with Gurbachan. It would take at least 15 minutes to change the tire. As soon as our eyes fell on the flat tire, we realized what had caused the puncture. Strewn over a large area on the road were hundreds of nails. It was obvious that they were new and had been brought recently. We exchanged glances. Gurbachan let out an expletive through clenched teeth that I shall not repeat here. Feluda said nothing. He simply stood there, arms akimbo, and stared at the road, deep in thought. His brows were drawn together in a frown. Lal Mohan Babu took out a green notebook. It looked like a diary, from an old Japan Airlines bag, and scribbled something in it with a pencil. By the time we finished changing the tire, removed all the nails from the road, and were ready to leave, it was 1:45. Feluda said to Gurbachan, "Sardarji, please keep an eye on the road. You can see that our enemies are trying to make things difficult for us. However, it wouldn't do to go too slowly if we were to reach Jaisalmer before nightfall." So Gurbachan Singh reduced his speed from 60 to 40. If he were to keep his eye on the road all the time, he could hardly move faster than 10 or 15 miles an hour. About 40 miles later, when we had covered almost 100 miles, the second disaster hit us. It simply could not be avoided. This time, instead of nails, thousands of drawing pins had been strewn over at least 20 feet of the road. Obviously, whoever wanted us to have a flat tire was not taking any chances. What was also obvious was that Gurbachan Singh did not have another spare tire. We all climbed out again. If Gurbachan Singh had not been wearing a turban, he probably would have scratched his head. Feluda asked him, "Is Pokhran a town or a village?" "It is a town, Babu." "How far is it?" "About 25 miles. "Oh God! What are we going to do?" Gurbachan tried to be reassuring. Every taxi that piled on that route, he said, was known to him. If we waited until another taxi came along, he would borrow a spare from its driver. Then we could go to Pokhran and have our own punctured tires mended. The question was, would a taxi come along? If so, when? How long were we supposed to wait in the middle of nowhere? A group of 3 men passed us by, leading 5 camels. They were going in the direction of Jodhpur. Each man had such dark skin that it looked almost black. One of them sported a snowy white beard and sideburns. I saw Lal Mohan Babu move closer to Feluda, possibly because he had caught the men casting curious glances at us. "Which is the nearest railway station from here?" Feluda asked, removing the pins from the road. We had all joined him in this good deed, to save other cars from a similar fate. "Ramdeura. It is 7 or 8 miles from here." Ramdeura. When all the pins had been removed, Feluda took out a Bradshaw timetable from his shoulder bag. One particular page was folded. Feluda opened the timetable at that page, ran his eye over it, and said, "It's no use. The morning train that leaves Jodhpur reaches Ramdeura at 3:45. It must have left Ramdeura by now." "But isn't there another train to Jaisalmer at night?" I asked. "Yes, but that will reach Ramdeura very early in the morning, at 3:53. If we began walking now, we'd take at least 2 hours to get to Ramdeura. There might have been a point in walking all that way, if there was any chance of catching the morning train. We could then have travelled to Pokhran, if nothing else. Now in this God-forsaken—" Feluda broke off. Even under such difficult circumstances, Lal Mohan Babu smiled and said in a somewhat unsteady voice, "Well, you must admit such a situation would be easier to find in a novel. Who knew even in real life?" Rather unexpectedly, Feluda raised a hand and stopped him. Our surroundings were completely silent, as if the entire world here had turned mute. In that silence, a faint noise reached our ears. There could be no mistake. Chuk-chuk, chuk-chuk, chuk-chuk. It was a train. The train to Pokhran. But where was the track? I stared in the direction from which the noise was coming, and suddenly noticed a column of smoke. Almost immediately, I spotted a telegraph pole. I hadn't seen it before, because the ground sloped down and the red pole practically merged with the reddish-brown earth. Had it been standing on higher ground, outlined against the sky, it would have been far more easily visible. "Run!" shouted Feluda, and began running towards the smoke. I followed suit. Lalmohan Babu followed me. To my amazement, he ran so fast, despite his thin and scraggy appearance, that he nearly caught up with Feluda, leaving me behind. I could see grass under my feet, but instead of being green, it was as white as cotton wool. We scrambled down the slope, still moving as fast as we could, and reached the railway track. The train was now within 100 yards. Without a second's hesitation, Feluda jumped into the middle of the track and began waving madly, both his arms raised high. The train began whistling loudly, but drowning the sound of the whistle rose Lalmohan Babu's voice. "Stop! Stop! Halt, I say!" Nothing worked. It was a small train, but not like the ones that Martin and company once used to run. If one stood by the tracks and raised a hand, those trains would stop, just like buses. This train, however, did nothing to reduce its speed. Whistling mightily, it came dangerously close, at which point Feluda was obliged to spring to safety. We simply stood and watched as the train coolly passed us by, clanging on its way, hiding the bright sun momentarily behind thick black smoke. Even at a time like that, I couldn't help thinking that I might have seen such a scene only in a Hollywood Western. Not once did I ever imagine I'd get to witness a scene like that in my own country. "Such arrogance," remarked Lalmohan Babu when the train had gone. "It didn't look bigger than a caterpillar, did it?" "Bad luck," muttered Feluda. "That train was running late, yet we couldn't take advantage of that. If we could have somehow got to Pokhran, we might have found another taxi." Gurbachan Singh, with great thoughtfulness, had collected our luggage and was carrying it over, but now there was no need for it. I glanced briefly at the track. All that could be seen was smoke. Suddenly, Lalmohan Babu spoke excitedly. "What about camels?" he said. "Camels? Over there. Look." Yes, another group of camels was coming our way, this time from the direction of Jodhpur. "Good idea. Let's go." At Feluda's words, we began running again. When a camel really gets going, I've heard that it can cover 20 miles in an hour, Lalmohan Babu told me as he ran. We managed to stop the group. This time, there were 2 men and 7 camels. "We need 3 camels, and we want to go to Ramdeura. How much would that be?" asked Feluda in Hindi. Then it turned out that the men spoke some local dialect. However, they could understand a little Hindi, and speak it too, albeit haltingly. Gurbachan spoke on our behalf. In the end, they agreed to lend us their camels for 10 rupees. "Can your camels run fast?" Lal Mohan Babu wanted to know. "We have a train to catch." Feluda laughed. "Don't worry about running. Get on the camel first." Get on its back? Perhaps for the first time, face to face with a camel, Lal Mohan Babu realized the complexities involved in climbing onto its back. I was looking carefully at the animals. They looked perfectly weird, but had been saddled with care. On their backs were the kind of sheets with fringes and tassels that I had seen earlier on elephants. On top of this sheet was a wooden seat. The sheet was covered with red, blue, yellow, and green geometric patterns. Each camel had its long neck wrapped with a length of red fabric decorated with cowrie shells. It was clear that in spite of their strange appearance, their owners loved and cared for them. 3 camels were now kneeling on the ground. Gurbachan Singh, by this time, had fetched every piece of our luggage, which consisted of 2 suitcases, 2 holdalls, and a few smaller items. Gurbachan told us to wait for him in Pokhran, if we could catch the train in Ramdeura. He would definitely get to Pokhran that night. Our luggage was tied securely onto 2 of the other camels. The first 3 camels were still waiting for us. "You saw how they sat down, didn't you?" Feluda asked Lal Mohan Babu. "A camel folds its forelegs first, and the front part of its body comes down before its rear. When it gets up, expect just the opposite. It will raise its hind legs first. If you can remember that and lean backwards and forwards accordingly, you can avoid a great deal of embarrassment." Embarrassment? Lal Mohan Babu croaked. "Here, watch me." Feluda jumped onto the back of the first camel. One of the men made a funny noise through his teeth. At once the camel raised itself, quickly but awkwardly, in exactly the same manner that Feluda had just described. But he managed very well. There was no awkwardness. "Come on, Topshe. You 2 are smaller and lighter than me. It should be easier for you," Feluda called. Both the Rajasthani men were grinning at our antics. I gathered all my courage and got on the second camel, which stood up immediately. Now I could tell where the real problem lay. When the hind legs were raised, the rider on the camel's back was likely to slide forward in one swift motion. If one could lean back and remain in that position as the camel rose to its feet, it would be easier to maintain one's balance. If I ever had to ride a camel again, I must remember that, I told myself. "Dear God," said Lal Mohan Babu. God became Gyad for the simple reason that, even as he was uttering those words, the rear portion of the camel's body jerked into motion, and Lal Mohan Babu slid forward on its back. In the next instant, he was thrown back in the opposite direction. I heard him gulp noisily as he lay horizontal on the camel's back, cast into an undignified heap. Having said goodbye to Gurbachan Singh, we 3 Bedouins began our journey to Ramdeura. "We must get to Ramdeura in half an hour. It's 8 miles from here, isn't it? We have a train to catch," Feluda yelled to the 2 men. At these words, one of them jumped up on his camel and marched forward briskly to take the lead. The second man shouted, "Hey, hey!" and every camel broke into a run. As it was, the animals were ungainly and not exactly easy to sit on. When they lurched forward, my whole body swung and shook from side to side. But I didn't mind. We were running across a sandy terrain, covered with dry, scorched grass, and the place was Rajasthan. So all in all, it was a thrilling experience. Feluda was ahead of me, and Lal Mohan Babu's camel was behind me. Feluda turned his head and called out, "How do you find the ship of the desert, Mr. Ganguly?" I, too, looked back to see what Lal Mohan Babu was doing. I found him making an awful grimace, as if he was in a freezing cold climate. His lips had parted, his teeth were clenched, and the veins on his neck were all standing out. "What's the matter?" Feluda went on. "Why don't you say something?" 6 words emerged from Lal Mohan Babu, in 5 installments. "Ship, all right, but talking, impossible." Laughter began bubbling up inside me once again, but I quelled it and focused on the journey. We were now running alongside the railway track. In the distance, a column of smoke seemed to rise for a minute. Then it disappeared. The sun was going down in the western horizon, and the landscape was changing. A hazy range of hills was visible in the far distance. On our right was a huge sand dune, unmarked by human feet. It was covered with wavy lines from top to bottom. Perhaps the camels were not used to running fast for any length of time, so their speed faltered every now and then. When that happened, one of the men barked, "Hey, hey!" again, and the animals ran faster. Around 4:15, a square structure came into view. It appeared to be a building, right next to the railway track. What could it be, if it wasn't a railway station? As we got closer, it became clear that we were right. There was a signal too, so it had to be a station, and the place had to be Ramdora. The camels had slowed down again, but now there was no news to shout at them. The train we were hoping to catch had come and gone. We couldn't tell when it had left, but there could be no doubt that we had missed it. It meant only one thing. Until 3 o'clock in the morning, we would have to wait in this unknown place, in the middle of nowhere, by the side of the tiny structure that was trying to pass itself off as a station. And there was not a soul in sight. Chapter 9. It turned out that the station was in the process of being built. All it had at the moment was a platform and that structure, which was really a ticket window. Heaven knew when the building work would be completed. We selected a spot close to the ticket window and sat on our holdalls, preparing ourselves for a long wait. A kerosene lamp hung from a wooden post nearby, so when it got dark, we would at least be able to see one another. There appeared to be signs of habitation not all that far from the station. Feluda went to have a look, then returned and said that although he had seen houses, there were no shops and nowhere to eat. All we had with us was a little water in our flasks, and Lal Mohan Babu had a tin of goja, deep-fried pastry dipped in syrup. Perhaps we would have to spend the whole night on the strength of those. The sun had set about 10 minutes ago. It would soon be dark. Gurbachan Singh's arrival did not seem likely, as in the last 3 hours we had not seen a single car go past, either towards Jodhpur or Jaisalmer. There was nothing to do but wait on the platform until the next train came at 3 o'clock. Feluda was sitting on his suitcase and gazing steadily at the track. I watched him cracking the fingers of his right hand with his left. Obviously, he was anxious or agitated about something, which was why he wasn't saying much. Lal Mohan Babu opened his tin, bit into a goja and said, "Who knew this would happen? If I didn't travel with you in the same compartment on the way from Agra, the entire nature of my holiday would not have changed like this, would it?" "Why? Do you mind?" Feluda asked. "No, of course not." Lal Mohan Babu laughed. "But it would certainly help if a few things were a bit clearer." "Which things in particular?" "I don't really know what's going on, do I? I feel a bit like a shuttlecock, slapped from one side to the other and back again. I mean, I don't even know who you are. Are you the hero or the villain? Ha ha." "Why do you want to know? What would you do anyway, if you knew?" Feluda asked with a smile. "When you write a novel, do you reveal everything at the outset? Why don't you treat this entire Rajasthani experience as a novel? When it comes to an end, every mystery will be cleared up." "And I? Will I still be alive? And in one piece?" "Well, you have already proved that you can run faster than a rabbit, if you have to. Isn't that reassuring enough?" I hadn't realized it before, but someone had come and lit the kerosene lamp while we were talking. In its light, I suddenly saw two men, clad in local Rajasthani garb with turbans on their heads, making their way towards us. In their hands were stout sticks, which they were tapping on the ground. They stopped a few feet away, squatted, and began a conversation in a completely incomprehensible language. One thing about those men made my jaw fall open. Both were sporting huge moustaches. They didn't just turn upward, but had in fact coiled at least 4 times on either side of the men's faces. The final effect was like the spring fitted inside a clock. If they were pulled straight, each side would probably measure 18 inches. Lal Mohan Babu too seemed totally dumbstruck by the sight. "Bandits," muttered Feluda under his breath. "Really?" Lal Mohan Babu quickly poured himself some water from the flask and gulped it down. "Undoubtedly." Lal Mohan Babu tried to replace the lid on his tin, but dropped it on the platform with a loud clang. The noise made him jump, and he became more nervous. I looked at the two men closely. Their skin was as dark and shiny as a freshly polished shoe. One of them took out a cigarette, placed it between his lips, and slapped all his pockets until he found a matchbox in one of them. But it turned out to be empty, so he threw it away on the track. A sudden noise made me glance at Feluda. He had flicked his lighter on and was offering it to the man. The man looked taken aback at first, then leant forward to light his cigarette. After that, he took the lighter from Feluda and examined it closely, pressing it here and there before finding the right spot and lighting it once more. Lal Mohan Babu tried to speak, but his voice sounded choked. The man switched the lighter on and off a few times before returning it to Feluda. Lal Mohan Babu began stuffing his tin back into his suitcase, but it slipped from his hand, and this time the whole tin fell on the ground, making a racket that was 10 times worse than the previous one. Feluda paid him no attention. He simply took out his blue notebook from his shoulder bag and began leafing through its pages in the dim light from the kerosene lamp. Suddenly, my eyes fell on a thorny bush a little way beyond the ticket window. A light was falling on it. Where was it coming from? It was growing brighter. Then I heard a car. It was coming from the direction of Jaisalmer. Oh, good. Perhaps Gurbachan Singh would now be able to borrow a spare tire. The car came into view, then whooshed past the little station and vanished towards Jodhpur. My watch showed 7:30. Feluda raised his eyes from his notebook and looked at Lal Mohan Babu. Lal Mohan Babu, he said, you write novels, don't you? You must know a lot of things. Can you tell me what a blister is and what causes it? Blister! Blister! Lal Mohan Babu sounded completely taken aback. Why does one get blisters, you mean? But one could, quite easily. I mean, suppose you burnt your finger while lighting your cigarette. Yes, but why should that cause a blister? Oh, I see. Why? You want to know the reason. All right, never mind. Tell me something else. If you look at a man from a height, why does he appear short? Lal Mohan Babu simply stared without a word. Even in that dim light, I could see him rubbing his hands uncertainly. The two Rajasthani men were still talking in that same language, using the same tone. Feluda's eyes were fixed on Lal Mohan Babu's face. Lal Mohan Babu licked his lips and found his voice. Why are you... all these questions? I have one more, and I'm sure you know the answer to this one. Lal Mohan Babu said nothing. It was as if Feluda had hypnotized him. This morning, what were you doing among the trees behind the circuit house, creeping up to my window? Just for a moment, Lal Mohan Babu remained motionless. Then life returned to his limbs, and he burst into speech. But I was going to see you, he declared, gesticulating wildly. Believe me, Mr. Mitter, it was you I wanted to see. But that peacock made such a racket, and then I heard someone scream, so I got all startled and nervous, and so... Was that the only way to get to my room? And was it necessary to wear a turban and a shawl to come and see me? Look, that shawl was only a bedsheet. I took it from my room. And the turban, that was a towel from the circuit house. I had to have some sort of a disguise, don't you see? Or how could I spy on that man? Which man? Mr. Trotter. Very suspicious, that man. But thank goodness I did go there. See what I found, lying on the grass outside his window. It's a secret code. I was going to pass it on to you when that peacock cried out and spoilt everything. I was looking carefully at Lal Mohan Babu's watch. Yes, it was the same watch I had seen from the terrace in the circuit house. Lal Mohan Babu opened his suitcase and groped in it. He fished out a crumpled piece of paper and handed it to Feluda. I could see that it had been screwed into a ball, but straightened later. I peered over Feluda's shoulder to see what was written on it with a pencil. It said, IP 1625 plus U. U minus M. Feluda frowned darkly at the piece of paper. Was it algebra? I couldn't make head or tail of it. Lalmohan Babu whispered a couple of times, "Highly suspicious." Feluda was muttering to himself. 1625. 1625. Where have I seen that number recently? Could it be the number of a taxi? I asked. No. 1625. 1625. Feluda left his sentence incomplete and pounced upon his shoulder bag. Then he took out the railway timetable and opened it at the page that was folded. He ran a finger quickly down the page and stopped abruptly. Yes, here it is. 1625 is the arrival. Where? Pokhran. In that case, I remarked, the P might mean Pokhran. 1625 in Pokhran. What about the rest? The rest is IP and then plus U. What could it... I don't like that M in the second line, Lalmohan Babu told us. The letter M always reminds me of the word murder. Wait, dear sir. Let me first deal with the top line. Lalmohan Babu continued to mutter under his breath. Murder, mystery, massacre, monster. Feluda sat with a piece of paper on his lap, lost in thought. Lalmohan Babu took out his tin of goja and offered it to me again. When I had taken one, he turned to Feluda and said, By the way, how did you know I had crept up to your window? Did you see me? Feluda helped himself to a goja. You took your turban off, but did not brush your hair. When I met you shortly after the incident, the state of your hair made me quite suspicious. Lalmohan Babu smiled. I hope you won't mind my saying it, sir, but you strike me as a detective, 100% full-fledged detective. Without saying anything, Feluda handed him one of his cards. Lalmohan Babu's eyes began glinting. Oh, Pradosh C. Mitter. Is that your real name? Yes. Why? Is there something wrong with it? No. But isn't it strange? What is? Your name. Look, it matches your profession. Pradosh, pronounced Pro-dosh. Pro stands for professional, and dosh is the Bengali word for crime. The C is to see, that is, to investigate. So the whole thing works out as Pradosh C, that is, professional crime investigator. Great! Well done! But what about Mitter? Mitter. Oh, that. I'll have to think about it, said Lalmohan Babu, scratching his head. There's no need. I can solve it for you. You have seen meters on taxis, haven't you? It's the same thing. That is to say, it's an indicator. So it doesn't just investigate, it also indicates. It picks out the criminal after an investigation and points a finger at him. Would you go along with that? Bravo, said Lalmohan Babu, clapping. But Feluda grew serious again. He glanced at the code, transferred it to his shirt pocket, and took out a cigarette. The I and the U can be easily explained, he said. That I is probably the fellow who wrote the code, and U is you. But that plus sign doesn't make sense, and the second line is totally obscure. Look, Topshe, why don't you spread your holdall on the platform here and try to get some sleep? You too, Lalmohan Babu. The train won't be here for another 7.5 hours. I will wake you up at the right time." It was not a bad idea. I unstrapped our holdall and spread it out. As soon as I lay flat on my back, my eyes went to the sky, and I realized I had never seen so many stars in my life. Was the sky so clear because we were closer to a desert? Perhaps. Soon, my eyes grew heavy with sleep. Once I heard Lal Mohan Babu say, "I say, riding a camel has made my joints ache." Then I thought I heard him mutter, "M is murder." After that I fell asleep. The next thing I knew, Feluda was trying to shake me awake. "Topshe, get up. Here comes the train." I scrambled to my feet and began rolling my holdall. By the time the straps had been fastened, the headlight on the train had come into view. Chapter 10. It was a passenger train running on meter gauge. Its compartments were therefore quite small. There were not many passengers either. Hence, when we found an empty first-class compartment, it did not surprise me. Inside the coach, it was dark. We groped for a switch, found it, and pressed it, to no avail. Lal Mohan Babu said, "Bulbs in railway compartments tend to vanish even in civilized areas. In this land of bandits, one shouldn't even expect to find any." "The two of you can take the benches. I will spread a durry on the floor and manage. We have 6 whole hours in hand. Time enough for a nice long nap," said Feluda. Lal Mohan Babu raised a mild objection to this plan. "Why should you be on the floor? Let me—" But Feluda said, "Certainly not," so sternly that he said nothing more. I saw him spread his holdall on one of the benches, not merely because of Feluda's words, but perhaps also out of concern for his aching joints. The train began pulling out of the platform. Within a minute of leaving the station, suddenly a figure jumped onto the footboard of our carriage. Lal Mohan Babu said with a laugh, "Hey, this is a reserved compartment. Ladies only." Then the door swung open quickly, and a bright light from a torch dazzled our eyes for a few seconds. We saw a hand coming towards us. The point of a gun shone in that light. All of us raised our arms high above our heads. "Get up, dear hearts. The door's open. Get out of the train. All of you." It was the voice of Mandar Bose. But the train's still running," said Lal Mohan Babu in a trembling voice. "Shut up," roared Mandar Bose and inched a little closer. The torchlight was playing on our faces constantly, never standing still for more than a few moments. "You're trying to be funny?" Mr. Bose went on. "What do you do in Calcutta? Don't you climb in and out of running buses? Get up, I tell you." Just as he finished speaking, something happened so totally unexpectedly that it took my breath away. I shall never forget it as long as I live. Feluda's right arm came down in a flash. He grasped a corner of the durry and yanked it off the floor. As a result, Mandar Bose lost his balance. His feet slipped, then rose in the air for a second, before he fell, the top half of his body hitting the wall of the carriage with a bang. At the same time, the revolver was knocked out of his hand. It fell on Lal Mohan Babu's bench, and the torch dropped from his left hand onto the floor. All that happened in a split second. Even before Mandar Bose crashed down on the floor, Feluda had sprung up, clutching his own revolver, which had come out of his jacket pocket. "Get up!" This time it was Feluda who ordered Mandar Bose. The meter gauge train was swinging and swaying across the desert, making a lot of noise. Lal Mohan Babu had, in the meantime, grabbed Mr. Bose's revolver and stuffed it into his own Japan Airlines bag. "Get up!" Feluda shouted again. The torch was rolling on the floor. I could see that it should really be focused on Mr. Bose, or the fellow might take advantage of the darkness and try to trick us. Some such thought made me bend down to pick it up, which led to disaster. Even now, my blood runs cold when I think about it. Mandar Bose was facing my bench. Just as I bent down, he suddenly lunged forward, grabbed me, and got to his feet, holding me firmly in front of himself. As a result, I became a protective shield for him. Even at such a critical moment, I couldn't help admiring his cunning. It was clear that although round one had gone to Feluda most unexpectedly, he was certainly in a difficult position in the second round, and I was wholly to blame. Mandar Bose kept a tight hold on me as he began moving towards the open door. I could feel something sharp hurting my shoulder. Then I realized it was one of his nails. Suddenly, I remembered little Neelu complaining that his hand hurt. We were now standing very close to the door. I could feel the biting cold night air. It was brushing against my left shoulder. Mandar Bose took another step. Feluda's gun was pointed at him, but now Feluda couldn't really do anything. The torch was still rolling on the floor as the train swayed from side to side. Suddenly, I was flung forward with considerable force. It made me collide with Feluda. The sound that came a second later told me that Mandar Bose had jumped out of the moving train. What I could not tell was whether he had survived or not. Feluda went to the door and peered out. He came back a couple of minutes later, replaced his revolver, and said, "I hope he breaks a few bones, or it will be a matter of great regret." Lal Mohan Babu laughed, a trifle loudly, and said, "Didn't I tell you the man was suspicious?" I gulped some water from the flask. My heartbeat was gradually returning to normal, as was my breathing. I was still finding it difficult to grasp the enormity of what had just happened, in a matter of minutes. "He got away this time only because of dear Topesh," said Feluda, "or I would have used my gun to drag a full confession out of him. However—" He stopped. After a brief pause, he said, "When I come face to face with danger, my brain starts working much more efficiently. I've noticed it before. Now I can see what that code meant." "Really?" Lal Mohan Babu was sounded amazed. "It's actually quite simple. I is the man writing the note. P is Pokhran. U is you, and M is Mitter, Pradosh Mitter. And the plus and minus signs? IP 1625 plus U. That means I am arriving at Pokhran at 4:25. You must join me. And U minus M? What does that mean? That's even simpler. It means you get rid of Mitter." "Get rid?" Lal Mohan Babu could barely speak. "You mean the minus sign stands for murder?" No, not necessarily. If you were forced to jump out of a moving train, chances are you would be injured. And in any case, you would have to wait another 24 hours for the next train. The crooks would have finished their business in that time. What they really needed to do was stop us from going to Jaisalmer. That's why they littered the road with nails and pins. But when they realized that hadn't worked, both tried to get us off the train. Suddenly, I became aware of a smell. "I can smell a cigar, Feluda," I exclaimed. Yes, I got that smell as soon as the fellow jumped into the compartment. It was obvious, even in the circuit house, that someone was smoking cigars. Remember that golden foil Mukul found? Cigars are wrapped in that kind of foil. And there is something else. One of his nails is much longer than others. My shoulder must be as badly scratched as Nilu's hand. All right, but who is the I who is giving all the instructions? Lal Mohan Babu wanted to know. Feluda's voice sounded solemn when he spoke. That morning someone had left for me in the circuit house, and this handwritten code both point to one person. Who? Lal Mohan Babu and I cried together. Dr. Hemanga Mohan Hajra. The rest of the night passed without further excitement. I slept for about 3 hours. When I woke, it was bright and sunny outside. Feluda was no longer lying on the floor. He was seated in one corner of my bench and staring out of the window. On his lap was his blue notebook, and in his hands were 2 notes. One was the warning, and the other was the letter Dr. Hajra had left for us before leaving Jodhpur. I glanced at my watch. It was 7:15. Lal Mohan Babu was still fast asleep. I felt very hungry, but had no wish to eat another goja. We would reach Jaisalmer at 9. Somehow, I must put up with the pangs of hunger until then. The scenery outside was really strange. For mile after mile stretched an undulating landscape. There was not a single house in sight, not a single human being, not even a tree. Yet, I could not call it a desert because, although there was a little sand, most of it consisted of dry, pale glass, reddish earth, and blackish-red chips of stone. It seemed incredible that after such a landscape, we would find a whole town again. The train stopped at a station called Jeta Chandan. I opened the railway timetable and discovered that the next station was called Taiyat Hamera, and the one after that was Jaisalmer. At Jeta Chandan, there were no shops or stalls on the platforms, no hawkers, no porters, no passengers. It was as if our train had somehow arrived at a place that had not yet been discovered by man. It was no different from a rocket landing on moon. Lal Mohan Babu woke soon after the train started moving again. He yawned and said, I had the most fantastic dream, you know. There was this gang of bandits, each with a moustache that looked like the horns of a ram. I had hypnotized them and was leading them through a castle. There was a tunnel. We went through the tunnel and reached an underground chamber. I knew there was some treasure buried in that chamber, but all I could see was a camel sitting on the floor, chewing gojas. How do you know that? Feluda asked. Did the camel open its mouth and show you what it was chewing? No, but I saw my tin, there it was, lying in front of the camel. Soon after we left Taiyat Hamera, in the distance, The hazy outline of a hill came into view. It was a Rajasthani table mountain with a flat top. Our train appeared to be going in that direction. Around 8 o'clock, we could dimly see some sort of structure on top of that hill. Slowly, it became clear that it was a fortress. It stood like a crown atop the hill, spread all around its flattened top. It was bathed in the bright light of the early morning sun, which was falling directly upon it from a dazzling sky. Quite involuntarily, 3 words slipped out of my mouth. "The Golden Fortress!" "That's right," Feluda told me. "This is the only golden fortress in Rajasthan. That bowl in that shop in Jodhpur raised my suspicions. Then I looked it up in the guidebook, and my suspicions were confirmed. The fort and the bowl were both made with the same stone, yellow sandstone. If Mughal is truly a Jatismar, and if there is truly something like a previous life, then I think he was born somewhere in this region." "But does Dr. Hajra know that?" I asked. Feluda did not reply. He was still staring at the fort. "You know something, Topshe?" he said finally. "There is something special about that golden light. It has helped me see the whole pattern of the spider's web very clearly." Chapter 11. The first thing we did on getting off the train in Jaisalmer was to stop at a tea stall and have a cup of tea and some sweets. It was a new kind of sweet, one that we hadn't had before. Feluda said it would do us good as it has glucose in it. A lot of activity lay ahead. The glucose would provide extra energy. We emerged from the station to find that there was not a single vehicle we could hire. No tongas, ekkas, cycle rickshaws, or taxis. There was a jeep waiting, but it was obviously not meant for hire. When we got off the train, I had noticed a black ambassador standing outside, but now even that had gone. "It's a small town," Feluda said. "I don't think a place is all that far from another. My guidebook says there is a duck bungalow. Let's go and find it." We set off, carrying our luggage. Soon enough, we found a petrol station, where a man gave us directions. In order to get to the duck bungalow, we would not have to climb the hill, he said. The bungalow was located on the plains, to the south of the hill. As we began walking again, Feluda looked at the tire marks on the sand and said, "That ambassador must have come this way." About 15 minutes later, we came upon a bungalow. A wooden board fixed to its gate told us that we had come to the right place. The black ambassador was parked in front of it. An old man wearing a khaki shirt and a short dhoti came out of an outhouse. On his head was a turban. Perhaps he had seen us arrive. Feluda asked him in Hindi if he was the chowkidar. The man nodded. It appeared from the way he was looking at us that our arrival was unexpected, and he didn't altogether approve of our sudden appearance, as no one was allowed to stay in the bungalow without prior permission. Feluda said nothing about staying there. All we wanted to do, he told the man, was leave our luggage in the bungalow. Then we'd try to get the necessary permission. "You'll have to see the Raja's secretary for that," said the chowkidar, and pointed us in the right direction. The palace, also made of yellow sandstone, was at some distance, but certain portions of it were visible, rising above the trees. The chowkidar raised no objections to our luggage being left there. he showed us into a small room where we dumped our suitcases and holdalls. Then we filled our flasks with fresh water, slung them on our shoulders, and asked him the way to the fort. "You want to go to the fort?" The question came from the far end of a passage. A gentleman had just come out of a room. He appeared no more than 40, had a clear complexion and a sharp nose, under which was a thin moustache, very carefully trimmed. A second later, he was joined by an older man, who was clutching a stick, the kind that we had seen in the market in Jodhpur, and was wearing an odd, somewhat ill-fitting black suit. I could not tell which part of the country they might be from. The second man was limping slightly, which explained the need for the stick. "Yes, a look at the fort might be interesting," said Feluda. "Come along with us. We are going that way." Feluda thought for a few moments, then agreed. "Thank you very much. It's very kind of you," he said. As we made our way to the car, Lalmohan Babu whispered into my ear, "I hope these men won't try to throw us out of a moving car." The car began its journey to the fort. The man with the stick asked us, "Are you from Calcutta?" "Yes," Feluda replied. To our left, in the distance, rising from the sand, were stone pillars. We had seen something similar in Devikund. Feluda said such structures were quite common in Rajasthan. Our car started going uphill. About a minute later, we heard another car. It was tooting urgently. That was a bit surprising, since we were not driving all that slowly and getting in its way. Feluda was sitting at the back with the two gentlemen. He turned around, peered through the glass, and suddenly said to our driver, "Stop! Please stop!" Our car pulled up by the side of the road. At once, a taxi came along and stopped on our right. Holding its steering wheel was Gurbachan Singh, greeting us with a smile. The three of us climbed out. Feluda said to the two men, "Thank you so much for your help, but this is our own taxi. It had broken down on the way to Jaisalmer, but now it's caught up with us." When we were back in his car, Gurbachan told us how, at 6:30 that morning, he had spotted another taxi going back from Jaisalmer. He knew its driver and managed to get a spare tire from him. Then he covered 90 miles in 2 hours. When he reached Jaisalmer, he simply waited at the petrol station until he spotted us inside the Black Ambassador. A little later, we found ourselves going through a market. There were shops everywhere. A loudspeaker was playing a Hindi song, and outside a small cinema was a poster advertising a Hindi film. "You want to see the fort?" Gurbachan asked. "Yes," Feluda told him. Gurbachan stopped the taxi and said, "This is its gate." To our right was a massive gate, beyond which rose a road, paved with stone, which led to a second gate. That, I realized, was the real entrance to the fort. The first one acted as the front gate. Behind the entrance, rising steeply, was the golden fortress of Jaisalmer. A guard was standing outside the front gate. Feluda went and asked him if he had seen a man with a small boy that morning. He indicated Mukul's height. "Yes, sir, they were here, but they have now left," replied the guard. "When did they leave?" "About half an hour ago." "Did they come by car?" Yes, sir, in a taxi. Which way did they go? Can you remember? The guard nodded and pointed at the road that went further west. We got back to the car and followed it, passing through little alleys and more shops. Lal Mohan Babu was sitting next to Gurbachan. Feluda and I were in the back seat. After a few minutes, Feluda suddenly asked, "You didn't bring your weapon with you, did you?" Startled by such a question, Lal Mohan Babu said, "The dodger? No, sorry, I mean that Nepali dagger." "Yes, sir, your dagger. That's in my suitcase." "In that case, take out Mandar Boshe's revolver from your Japan Airlines bag and tuck it into your belt. Make sure it isn't visible." From Lal Mohan Babu's movements, it became clear that he was following Feluda's instruction. I was dying to see his face, but couldn't. "Don't worry," Feluda said reassuringly. "If things get sticky, all you have to do is take that gun out and point it in front of you." "What if behind me there is—" "If you hear a noise behind you, then just turn around. Then your behind will become your front. See?" "And you? Today, are you going to be non-violent?" "That depends." Our taxi left the market behind and came to an open space. We had already asked a couple of men on the way and learnt that the other taxi had been seen coming this way. Besides, we had also seen tire marks in the sand from time to time, which told us that we were following the same route that Dr. Hemanga Hajra had taken. Gurbachan Singh came up with more information. "This is the way to Mohangarh," he said. "I could drive for another mile, but after that the road gets really rough. Only jeeps can travel on that road, nothing else." But we didn't have to go another mile. Only a little later, we saw a taxi standing on one side of the road. To our right, at some distance, were a number of old, abandoned stone houses. All the roofs had caved in. Clearly, it had once been a village. We had seen similar villages elsewhere. People had moved out of them a long time ago. The walls of these houses were still standing only because they were made of stone. We told Gurbachan to wait and made our way to the houses. I saw Gurbachan get out of his car and go towards the other one, perhaps to chat with its driver. Everything was eerily silent. If I turned my head, I could see the fort behind me, on top of the hill. Opposite the road, another hill rose steeply. At its foot, spread over a wide open area, were rows of yellow stones, embedded in the ground. They looked like giant spice grinders. "Graves of warriors," whispered Feluda. Lal Mohan Babu spoke, in a hoarse yet squeaky voice. I have low blood pressure." "Don't you worry," Feluda replied. "It will soon rise higher, I promise you, and stop exactly where it should." We were now quite close to the houses. A path ran straight through them. I realized this village was different from the ones I had seen in Bengal. It had a simple, geometric plan. But where were the people who had travelled in the other taxi? Where was Mukul and Dr. Hajra? Had something happened to Mukul? Suddenly, I became aware of a noise. It was faint, but audible if I strained my ears. Thud, 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 We walked on, very carefully and very silently. Then we reached a crossroad where two lanes intersected. The noise was coming from the right. 10 or 12 houses stood by the road. There were yawning gaps between their walls, and where once there must have been doors. We turned right and resumed walking stealthily. Feluda uttered one word through his teeth, almost inaudibly. Revolver. I saw that his hand had disappeared under his jacket. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a revolver in Lal Mohan Babu's hand, which was trembling violently. A sudden crunching noise made us come to a halt. In the next instant, through the door of a house at the far end on our left, appeared Mukul, running fast. Then he saw us, ran even faster, and flung himself on Feluda's chest. He was gasping. His face was deathly pale. I opened my mouth to ask him what had happened, but Feluda placed a finger on his lips and stopped me from speaking aloud. Please look after him until I return, he whispered to Lal Mohan Babu, and left Mukul in his charge. Then he proceeded towards the house from which we had just seen Mukul emerge. I followed Feluda. The strange noise was getting louder. It sounded as if someone was lifting stones. Thud, bang, clang, it went on. Feluda flattened himself against the wall as we got close to the house. A couple of steps later, we were able to peer through the gap left by the missing door. With his back to us, crouching over a huge pile of rubble, was Dr. Hajra. Like a madman, he was removing stone after stone from that heap and casting each one aside. He had no idea that we were standing so close. Feluda took another step, pointing his revolver at Dr. Hajra. Suddenly, we heard a flutter above our heads. A peacock swooped down from the compound wall. It sped towards Dr. Hajra the instant it landed, and attacked him, pecking hard just under his left ear. Dr. Hajra, who was still crouching over the stones, could only scream in agony and press his hand over that spot. At once, the white cuff of his shirt turned red. But the peacock hadn't finished. It continued to attack him, pecking wherever it could. Dr. Hajra turned, took a step towards the door in an attempt to escape, and saw us. He started as if he had seen a pair of ghosts. We stepped aside. The peacock chased him out through the door. You did not imagine, did you, that a peacock would have built its nest, and that nest would contain its eggs in the same spot where the treasure was buried? Feluda's voice sounded as cold as steel. His revolver was pointed at Dr. Hajra. It was clear to me now that the real culprit in this whole affair was Dr. Hajra, and he had been suitably punished already. But there were so many other things that still seemed hazy that my head started reeling. Then we heard a car. Dr. Hajra fell to the ground. He was lying on his stomach. He lifted his head and turned it slowly towards Feluda. His left hand, clutching a blood-stained handkerchief, was still pressed against his wound. There is absolutely no hope left for you. I hope you realize that. Every route of escape is closed. And... Before Feluda could finish speaking, Dr. Hajra sprang to his feet and began running blindly in the opposite direction, away from the derelict house. Feluda lowered his gun because there really was no way that Dr. Hajra could now escape. Two men, whom I recognized, were walking towards us. The one who was not hampered by a stick caught Dr. Hajra neatly in his arms, as if he were a cricket ball. The other man clutching the stick approached Feluda. I saw Feluda transfer his revolver to his left hand and offer the man his right hand. "Hello, Dr. Hajra," he said. "What? That man was Dr. Hajra?" He shook hands with Feluda. "And you are Pradosh Mitter?" "Yes." "Those new Nagras caused blisters on your feet, didn't they? Are they still bothering you?" The real Dr. Hajra smiled. "I rang Mr. Dhar the day before yesterday. He told me you were here. I had no problem in recognizing you from his description. Allow me to introduce you. This is Inspector Rator." "And what about him?" Feluda pointed at the other man, whom until now we had known as Dr. Hajra. He was now handcuffed and hanging his head. "Is that Bhavananda?" "Yes," Dr. Hajra replied, "alias Amiyanath Burman, alias the Great Barman, Wizard of the East." Chapter 12. Bhavananda was handed over to the local police. The charges against him were many. They included an attempt to murder Hemang Hajra, disappearing with his belongings, and trying to pass himself off as Dr. Hajra. We were back in the Dug Bungalow, having coffee, made with camel's milk, on the veranda. Mukul was romping happily on the lawn in front of us. He knew he would leave for Calcutta the same night. Having seen the Golden Fortress, he had no wish to remain in Rajasthan any longer. Feluda turned to the real Dr. Hajra and said, "Bhavananda was truly a fraud, wasn't he? I mean, what he did in Chicago, and all that I read in the press reports, was all of it true?" "Yes, 100%. Bhavananda and his accomplice cheated and swindled others in various countries, not just one. Besides, back in Chicago, they were doing something else. Not only were they out to deceive everyone, but they were also spreading evil tales and rumors about me, which was affecting my work. So, in the end, I was forced to take certain steps. But all that happened 4 years ago. I do not know when they returned to India. I came back only 3 months ago. One day, I happened to be in Mr. Dhar's shop when I heard about his son. So I went to meet him. You know the rest. When I decided to travel to Rajasthan with Mukul, I had no idea I'd be followed." "Who wouldn't want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone?" Feluda asked. "There was the chance to grab that hidden treasure, plus settle scores with you. But didn't you see them anywhere in Calcutta?" "No, not once. The first time I met them was in the refreshment room in the station at Bandikwi. The 2 men came up to me and began chatting." "You didn't recognize them?" "No. How could I? I had only seen them in Chicago, when they had long hair, flowing beards, and fat mustaches." "What happened next?" "They sat at the same table and had a meal with us. They told Mukul they knew magic and even pulled some tricks. Then they got into the same compartment with us. I got off at Kisangar to show Mukul the fort there, but didn't realize that those 2 characters had followed me. They reached the fort soon after us and hid somewhere until the coast was clear. It was a deserted place, in any case. There was no one in sight. When they found an opportunity, they pushed me down a slope. I rolled down, perhaps 100 feet. Luckily, my fall was broken by a clump of bushes. If I take my shirt off, you will see that my body is still covered with bruises. Anyway, I remained by the side of that bush for a whole hour. I wanted them to think that they had managed to get rid of me and leave with Mukul. At least, Mukul would then be safe. By the time I got up and walked to the station, the 8 o'clock train to Marwar had gone. The two criminals had left by the same train, with Mukul and my luggage. All my papers were in my suitcase, so there was no way I could prove to anyone who I really was. Didn't Mukul mind going with them? Dr. Hajra smiled. Mukul was in a totally distracted state of mind. Didn't you realize that? He had no problem leaving his own parents and setting off with me. So why should he make a distinction between one strange man and another? Bhavananda told him he would take him to the Golden Fortress. That was enough to entice Mukul. Anyway, I didn't give up. If anything, I was more determined now to get to the bottom of this business. Fortunately, I still had my wallet with me, so I could buy new clothes, local Rajasthani ones. I packed my old torn ones into a bundle. I wasn't used to wearing nagras, you see, so I got blisters on my feet. The next day, I boarded the train at Kishangarh and got into your compartment. Then I took the same train as you from Marwar to Jodhpur. I went to stay in a place called Raghunath Sarai. I knew someone in Jodhpur, one Professor Trivedi. But at first, I told him nothing. If the matter came to be known, the two men might have tried to run away, or Mukul himself might have felt scared or refused to cooperate. By then I had guessed that the fort in Jaisalmer was where Mukul should be taken. All I had to do was wait until Bhavananda had the same idea and left with Mukul. Until then, my job was to keep an eye on the pair. We saw someone hanging around the circuit house on the very first day. It was you, wasn't it? Yes, and that caused another problem. Mukul saw me and seemed to recognize me. At least, that's how it appeared from the way he came out of the gate and began walking straight towards me. So later, you followed Bhavananda and got into the same train that was going to Pokhran? Yes. The strangest thing was that I saw you from the train, trying to stop it. Bhavananda must have seen me too. He would then have realized we would try to catch the early morning train from Ramdeura. Dr. Hajra continued with his story. Before I caught that train, I told Trivedi to inform the police in Jaisalmer. Before that, I had spoken to Mr. Dhar from Trivedi's house, and then I borrowed one of his suits to dress normally. And when you got to Pokhran, you saw that Bhavananda's assistant was already there with a taxi? Is that right? Feluda wanted to know. That's where things went wrong. I lost them. Then I had to wait another 10 hours and catch that early morning train. I had no idea that you were on the same train. I saw you here in the Duck Bungalow. Now, what I would like to know is, when did you first start suspecting Bhavananda? Feluda smiled. It would be wrong to say that I suspected Bhavananda. It was the character of Dr. Hajra that made me suspicious. Not in Jodhpur, but in Bikaner. When we went to Devikund, we found him with his hands tied, his mouth gagged. Just before that, I had found a matchbox with an ace printed on it. I knew that particular brand isn't sold in Rajasthan. Then, when we saw Dr. Hajra lying on the ground so helplessly, at first I thought that matchbox was dropped by whoever had attacked him. But then I noticed that there was something wrong with the way he was tied up. I mean, if a man's hands and legs are tied, that may make him perfectly immobile. But if only his hands are tied behind his back, any intelligent man will fold his legs, slip his hands below them, and loosen his ties. Then he can set himself free. It became clear to me that Dr. Hajra had tied himself up. But even so, it did not occur to me at the time that the man was not the real Hajra. The scales fell from my eyes this morning, in the train to Jaisalmer, when I happened to be staring at a note Bhavananda had written to me. He had used a sheet of your letterhead. So? How was that significant? The printed letter showed Hajra with a J. But Bhavananda, pretending to be you, had signed his name Hazra with a Z. That told me that the man I had met in Jodhpur and who had written that note was not the real Dr. Hajra. But in that case, who was he? He had to be one of those men who had kidnapped Neelu. And the other man was Mandar Bose, who had one long nail on his right hand, who smoked cigars. Neelu had recognized the smell, and so had we. The question now was, who was the real Dr. Hajra, and where was he? There could be only one answer to that. Hajra had to be that same man who had got into our compartment at Kishangarh, who had new nagras and blisters on his feet, who was seen loitering outside the circuit house and the Bikaner fort, and who we saw this morning in the Duck Bungalow in Jaisalmer, limping with a stick in his hand. Dr. Hajra nodded. Mr. Tar did a most intelligent thing by asking you to come here. I don't think I could have managed entirely on my own. It was you who tackled Bhavananda's assistant. If he is arrested as well, we can then say that all ended happily. Feluda pointed at Lal Mohan Babu and said, He made a significant contribution towards raising the alarm against Mandar Bose. Lal Mohan Babu was struggling all this while to get in a word. Now he blurted out, I say, what's going to happen to that hidden treasure? Why don't you leave it to the peacock? Said Dr. Hajra. It's guarding it quite admirably, isn't it? You saw what happens when you meddle with a peacock. For the moment, suggested Feluda, kindly return the treasure you have got hidden. Mind you, from the way your jacket is bulging near your waist, one can hardly call it hidden. Lal Mohan Babu looked positively sad as he pulled out Mandar Bose's revolver and returned it to Feluda. Thank you, said Feluda as he took it. Then his face suddenly grew grave. I saw him examine the revolver closely. I must hand it to you, Mr. Trotter, he muttered. Who knew you would hoodwink Pradesh Mitter like this? Why? What's happened? We cried. This revolver is a fake, made in Japan. Magicians use such guns on the stage. Just before everyone burst into laughter, Lal Mohan Babu took the revolver back from Feluda, grinned and said, From my collection, and as a souvenir of our powerful adventure in Rajasthan. Thank you, sir. The Golden Fortress.